recorded by Hansard.
Great.
Thank you. So we have one apology so far from the Chair, Dahi McKay. Any other apologies that you're aware of? Not at the moment, okay. So we'll proceed to item 2, which is draft minutes of proceedings, 19th of November. They're at pages 5 to 10 of your packs. Are members content that the draft minutes are an accurate record of proceedings? Agree to publish them on the website?
Yes.
Thank you. Item number 3 is matters arising. There's a summary table of requests for information from DFP. That's at pages 12 to 16 of your packs. That's for noting. There's a secretariat paper on the late provision of papers by DFP at pages 3 to 11 of the table papers, and I'll ask the clerk to speak to that.
Yeah, Chair, just arising from last week's meeting where there was a session postponed due to a late paper, we just checked back on the records, and I've just prepared this short paper for members to consider. That's at page 3 of the table papers. So previously there had been issues around late papers from the department and oral briefings postponed at short notice. So back in April the committee considered the issue and agreed some steps to take, and one of which was to continue receiving reports from the department on performance and meeting agreed protocols in terms of timescales that apply across all committees for delivery of papers. The report was received for 13-14, and whenever we actually checked it against our records, there's a variance. Just at paragraphs 5 and 6 of the paper, you'll see there the DFP paper was showing 82% of briefing papers received in time and 78% of correspondence. The committee's records were showing a different picture, 55% of briefing papers and 71% of correspondence on time. So we've endeavoured to try and square the two, but without any joy. It's probably seems to be around issues of definition and interpretation. So just in terms of going forward, there's some suggestions there in terms of trying to kind of come up with agreed figures in future. So at paragraph 7, there's three steps proposed. One of which is to that the committee would receive reports on every 4 months, and then on an ongoing basis, on a weekly basis, the committee staff would actually agree the figures with the departmental liaison staff, so that there's no variance in those, and also that we would record the number of oral briefings postponed. So it's just to try and tighten up on the reporting system, Chair, going forward. Members are
okay. Members content?
Yes, that seems good.
Just draw your attention to the take note debate on the budget. The Business Committee has noted that the Finance Minister is not available to respond to the take note debate on the 8th of December, and the Minister's private office has indicated that the Minister may be available on the 19th of December. He's also suggested that the committee may wish to consider conducting the debate in the new year once the consultation has concluded. However, this would require more time to be afforded to the planned process by DFP to ensure that the debate is conducted prior to the executive agreeing the final budget. Also, on checking previous convention, the committee has conducted its debates on the 08-11 and 11-15 budgets whilst the public consultations were ongoing.
Chair, can I clarify just in terms of then, if we're talking about, appreciate what's been said so far now, what's the date at which the public consultation ends?
29th of December, Chair.
Yeah.
29th of December, okay.
And the department has advised it's hoping to go to the executive on the 8th of January with the final budget. That was the last position we got. It may have changed, but that's the most recent position.
Mm-hmm. Now, I suppose we have to decide this matter after the Minister's session today, in case there may be any update on his availability. So we can either decide to reschedule the debate to another mutually convenient date, or to press ahead with the 8th of December, on which date there would be a stand-in minister for the debate. So it's probably preferable to see is there any further information from the Minister this morning before we make a decision on it. Members agreed with that?
You want to stand in, Chair? You
Yeah. Okay. So we'll move then to item number 4 on the agenda, which is the draft budget 2015-16 Assembly Research briefing. And I would like to welcome Michael Scholes, Pamela Dugdale and Colin Pigeon, and ask them to highlight the key points from their papers before taking questions. And Pamela, are you going to begin?
No, it's actually Michael's going to start.
No, it's just because you're in the middle. I thought maybe you were.
Okay, we're sitting.
You were central person.
Yes.
We're going for symmetry here.
Okay, thank you, Michael.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. We have produced 5 papers in the draft budget and have been asked to come here to present 3 of them. I'm going to begin with financing the budget, which is paper 2 in the series of 5. Pamela's then going to discuss infrastructure investment, and Colin will conclude on his paper on access to the UK Reserve, and we'll, as you said, take questions at the end. So, under current devolution, to fund the budget, the Executive can avail of financing measures that are outside the block grant. Now, these measures include borrowing, regional rates, water charging and European funding. So I'm just going to go through the key points of the paper, mentioning each of those points and some scrutiny points that the committee may wish to consider. I'd just like to point out that in all of the papers, the scrutiny points are in block, following each of the points. So to start off with borrowing then, the Executive may borrow up to 250 million from the UK Government to manage short-term cash flow. And they can also borrow to fund capital investment via the Reform and Reinvestment Initiative, or RRI as it's known. So some scrutiny points then that arise around temporary borrowing. Did the Executive consider using a temporary borrowing facility to help finance the draft budget? If so, what was its rationale for not using it? Some key points then around RRI borrowing. Since its inception in 2003, the Executive's use of RRI borrowing has steadily increased. The Executive has also exceeded the annual RRI borrowing limit of 200 million per year on several occasions. And the draft budget proposes to allocate 63.4 million of non-ring-fenced resource debt from RRI interest repayments in 2015-16. And the Executive also forecasts that interest payments on these loans will be 35 million in the year 2024-25. So some scrutiny points then around the RRI borrowing facility. How does the Executive plan to cut its apparent reliance on RRI borrowing and stop breaching the annual borrowing limit? How does the Executive plan to finance capital projects in future years without having to rely on this type of borrowing? So we'll move on to the regional rate. The Executive proposes to increase the regional rate only in line with inflation. Now, this would result in an estimated 649.8 million revenue in 2015-16. So scrutiny point would arise then that given the limited options available to the Executive for increasing revenue and the apparent restriction on funding from UK Government, is it prudent that the Executive does not avail of the revenue raising potential of the regional rate?
Jerry, just maybe interrupt there a little bit, just in terms of that, and maybe you have in your figures, maybe I haven't seen it, in terms of what the pro rata sort of a 1% increase would equate to in terms of that, as to what you have as the figure in that?
Well, we haven't actually done figures on that. We actually did a slight different calculation on that, as you can see on page 12 there, where we really focused on varying the maximum capital rate value, the cap, on it, so we approached it from that
I
angle.
think we potentially could look a little bit silly if we ask, why aren't you going for a much greater rate rise? We don't actually know what that's going to bring in.
Yeah, well, we certainly could look at that. Yeah.
Sorry, could I have that question again? Because I thought it was clear here.
The point they're making is that they have figures basically on the basis of what the impact in terms of rate cap or otherwise is. But the question they were suggesting was, why are the executive not going for a higher than inflation rate rise? The problem on it is, if we don't have the figures saying what, for example, if we had increased that by another 1%, what that would bring in, it looks a little bit from our point of view. If we're asking that, we don't have the figures in ourselves.
And also the regional rate isn't set for 15-16 yet, so that would
Understand that, yeah.
that would be one of the reasons why we didn't use that type of calculation. Okay, so if we move on to water charges, key points. Now, the section of the paper really drew on work that was previously commissioned by the Committee for Regional Development, and a colleague of ours in research that works closely with that committee helped us a lot on this section of the paper. So Northern Ireland households are unique in the UK in not paying a direct charge for water and sewage services. The Executive currently subsidise NI Water by approximately 300 million per year to cover water charges. The level of subsidy is forecasted to increase steadily in the coming years. So some scrutiny points. Given Northern Ireland's current public finance situation, the committee may wish to consider if it is prudent that the Executive continues to subsidise NI Water to the extent that it does. And also, is it prudent that the Executive does not avail of the revenue-raising potential of water charges? So moving on now to EU funding. The Executive needs to ensure that it is given full and proper consideration to the receipts for EU funding. This is to ensure that it will be adequate. So this is to ensure that there will be adequate match funding from Northern Ireland's DEL or from external private sources as appropriate, so that EU requirements are met and EU monies are not lost for Northern Ireland. So a scrutiny point from that, how has the Executive undertaken an assessment to determine the level of co-financing that's needed by individual departments for programmes that are already underway, as well as those that are start, to ensure that, again, that money is not lost?
Today's next paper is number 4 in the series, as Michael has already indicated, and it focuses on infrastructure investment, financial transaction capital and the European Investment Bank.
Give us just a second. Which number is this paper?
Number 4 of the series of 5.
It's pages 36 to 47 in the pack. Draft budget, paper 4. Thank you.
Okay. As I said, it focuses on infrastructure investment, financial transaction capital and the European Investment Bank. I'm just going to go through a few key points from the paper and some scrutiny points which the committee may wish to investigate with the department. The first of these relates to the £35 million of FT capital, which the Minister has stated is unallocated for the current financial year. The committee may wish to engage with DFP to assess how much of this may have to be surrendered at the end of the year. The next point also relates to FT capital. There's £115.6 million allocated for the 2015-16 year. However, the Minister has stated that a number of the projects that this is allocated to will require further refinement, and the committee may wish to inquire how much of that 115 is allocated to projects that require the further refinement, considering how many projects, in the previous years, even projects that have been sort of pinned down didn't actually take off in the way that the different departments had hoped they would.
There is a list for that, 115.6, though, are they being produced?
Is there? I haven't received it yet. Is it clear which ones are requiring further
Yes, and
refinement?
particularly which ones aren't.
Also, it is not clear from the information currently available how the depositing of FT capital with the European Investment Bank complies with the rules around its use, particularly the investment. The loans too are equity investment with the private sector entity. Also, the need to surrender unused FT capital. The information that we have reviewed doesn't indicate how investing with the European Investment Bank would circumvent the requirement for funds to be surrendered at the end of the year. Also, the Minister has stated that a feasibility study will be carried out for the proposed new Northern Ireland Investment Fund, and it's not clear how this new strategy will relate to the current investment strategy of Northern Ireland, which is due to continue until 2021.
Could I ask a question around that, Chair? Could we tease it out now rather than waiting to the end, because by the end my mind will be addled.
Well, I think we'll wait until the end, if you don't mind.
Okay.
We have three papers and all. Do you want to continue?
That's the end of that paper.
All right. So, the timing is impeccable, Martin.
Thank you very much. I almost forgot my question. Look, those were your key points. I mean, I think everyone around this table is very much in favour of the Minister finding a way to use the capital or to put it into a bank or put it anywhere rather than give it back. But I want to just go through the figures about the financial transactions capital, because you said there's 35 million unallocated for this financial year.
That was an announcement within the budget.
Okay. And then there's 115 million for next year, and some of that there's some issues with. But is there not another figure as well that the Minister said he was going to put into this new investment fund?
He had stated on a couple of occasions there's an amount for the investment fund, but he'd also stated in a question raised by Mr. Cree that it is possible that we may be able to use some of the unspent 35 million of FTC and deposit it with the European Investment Bank for the investment fund in advance of it starting to work next year.
So just tell me what sums that the Minister's trying to set aside for the investment fund at this stage. So some of this 35?
Some of that 35, and then also he is in his statement, he said the executive had agreed that the unallocated 12.1 million will be set aside to provide an initial balance for the fund. So
is that 47 or not? No?
I don't really know, because it's not clear. I think that's the crux of the paper. It's not really clear where all the numbers are coming from. I don't know whether from the initial statement, I thought the 12.1 was for 15-16, because that's out of the budget statement. However, in response to Mr. Cree's question, he also stated that some of the 35 million could be used to set up. So I think they're two separate amounts, but I wouldn't be clear on that. And I think it's something that possibly to engage with the Minister to clarify.
You can only carry 10% of the current year's FTC forward. There's over 30 million going to begging.
Well, the thing is that he's hoping, from his statement in response to your question, it might be saved having to be surrendered by investing it with the European Investment Bank. But it's not clear how that complies with the rules around the scheme, because it is supposed to be an investment in or a loan to a private sector entity. So I'm afraid I'm sort of saying...
Are those Treasury rules?
Yes.
Okay, it's a great idea. We want to get from 12.1 million to a billion, which we want to get into the fund, so we'll do some work on that.
Well, I think the billion is to be leveraged. I think the billion isn't how much is going to be put into the fund. I think it's what's hoped to be leveraged.
No, I understand it, but it's still quite a leap from 12.1. But I'm in favour of making that leap. So let's just see how we'll do it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, happy enough, Martin, for the moment. Yes. Thanks very much, Pamela. We'll move on to the next paper, which is key aspects of Treasury discretion.
Yeah, this actually...
That's pages 48, 57.
Sorry, Chair, I cut across
okay.
there.
No problem, Colin.
This paper actually, it sort of builds on the third paper in the series, which talks in some detail and frankly some quite deep detail about how the mechanisms around access to the reserve work. So there's quite a lot in there, but really what we wanted to do with this last paper in the series, paper 5, about the aspects of Treasury discretion, was just to focus on two key elements of the way the budget is proposed to be financed, because they do hinge on the approval of the Treasury. The first one of those is the plan that the Minister announced, that the mechanism for repaying the 100 million to the UK Reserve, remember we talked about this last week, the 100 million will have to come out of next year's budget. Now, generally speaking, it's 100 million of resource money that we've been allowed access to from the Reserve, but the plan to repay that is to use capital receipts from next year. So the normally Treasury rules allow resource money to be converted to capital for investment purposes, but it would be pretty unusual for a capital sum to be converted to a resource spend. So that's a novel proposal, and I mean obviously I have no feel for whether the Treasury will agree to that or not. One of the issues, I suppose, is that if you're planning to dispose of capital assets up to a certain level, and we've had problems in the past about the forecasting of the value of assets and how much is actually going to be realised, and if you put pressure on the sale of the assets because you have to release the money by a certain time in order to repay the reserve claim, does that introduce a risk that you're going to be disposing at less than the best value you could attain for those assets? So there's one consideration there, aside from the issue of actually whether or not the Treasury will allow it to happen. Now, if the Treasury does not allow that switch of categories, the issue then will be, well, where will the 100 million for the reserve repayment come from? It will have to come from somewhere else. That's really the point. You know, if we've already, and the difficulty is because this year we've had to go to the reserves because we haven't managed to live within the budget. If this proposal is not accepted by the Treasury, then you're adding another 100 million pressure to the resource side, which will then presumably have to be cut from another department's baseline or from one of these other sort of central funds. So I suppose, in a way, that there must be a slight concern that what's happening there by using the public assets is a bit like, to put it into the lay, it's like selling off the family silver to pay off the overdraft, in a way, which...
I got the impression that there was some sort of relaxation of that particular rule around this situation here, but we can clarify that one.
Well, I think it's just really to clarify, because when the department were in previously and the official was asked, the official said that she was reasonably confident, I think, with the words, but
yeah.
I think there's a gap between reasonably confident and certain. Which could be an issue. And then secondly, in relation to this, now again, where the Treasury has discretion, I think, is where there's a proposal to use up to 100 million of the RRI borrowing facility that Michael was referring to earlier, to fund the workforce restructuring plan, which the Minister announced was due on, I think it was 2 weeks from the statement, so it would have been Monday past, that the head of the Civil Service was to bring forward this workforce restructuring plan. Now, an element of that presumably is going to be is likely to be voluntary redundancies, which will have to be paid for. But the question then is whether that's a good use of the executive's borrowing power, for a start, in terms of borrowing that would normally be used for capital investment, and whether that makes a good use of that in order to potentially make people redundant, or what other mechanisms they're using within the restructuring plan. And again, in order to do that, I think the Minister referred to the requirement for the Treasury to agree to that. So again, if the Treasury don't agree to that, and the workforce restructuring plan does require this £100 million, the £100 million will have to be found from somewhere else. It's
I suppose the only
a
thing
simple
is,
point.
from the Treasury's point of view, it kind of makes a certain level of logical sense, clearly, in that regard, because essentially if they're able to help out redundancy plan, which actually then cuts the amount of money that is needed in terms of that, it's a fairly wise investment from their point of view on that side of things.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't like to second guess the Treasury, but I suppose if you were sitting there and you had the choice of either, particularly with the repayment of the reserve, you had the choice of allowing a reclassification of capital money or possibly risking not getting your £100 million back from resource money. I suppose you would take that. You would say, yeah, that makes sense. And I take your point. Yeah, it possibly does make sense from their perspective. So the other issue around the use of the RI borrowing is that in the Minister's statement he did refer to wanting to continue to support local construction firms and make investments and support the local economy. But that doesn't really square with using up to half of the borrowing power for, a workforce restructuring programme. Necessary as it may be, it's not coming from the same place. So that's really those 2 points. If there are any more questions for any of us, we're certainly happy to take them. I know there's quite a few issues there.
Just Chair, how will redundancies be funded? Is it one-off payment? Is it payment? Do we take all that paying up front, as it were? And do we have any idea of what the average redundancy? There haven't been any redundancies here recently, but what will the average redundancy cost? I'm wondering just how far the 100 million will go.
Yeah, I don't have a feel for that at all, I'm afraid. I mean, in terms of, it's an upfront cost that you have to pay, because you have to pay the under the pension schemes, the compensation schemes that exist. You will have to pay a certain percent, or for every. I'm trying to think, the civil service scheme, it's for every month of. No, so for every year of service you have, you get a month's salary, up to a limit of, now this changed and I should remember because I remember doing a bill paper on it, it was up to 13 months, I think. Or 21. Right, yeah, 21 okay. Was it? Yeah. Sure, so, but anyway, but the point is that you have to meet that cost up front, and then it releases then obviously your annual salary costs for the period that person would have worked, I suppose. So that's a cash releasing figure.
There was,
okay.
There was some questions asked of the Minister about the scheme to reduce the headcount in the civil service, and he said at the time that the details of that hadn't been worked out yet. Obviously, the biggest savings would be to reduce those who have the highest salaries, but strategically, it may not be sensible to take that amount of experience out of the civil service in one fell swoop. So I think they're looking at how that should be done. Obviously, the more junior the people who take redundancy, the less the cost. So it's a question that we can explore with the Minister later on, I think.
To build on that a little bit, Chair, I mean, one of the questions I think we raised in our lines of questioning paper that we put out, we put to the committee just after the Minister's statement, was to what extent have other options around reducing the pay bill been looked at? Because there seems to have been a lot of talk. I think the DARD Minister was talking about 300 possible redundancies in that department yesterday. the talk all seems to be about headcount reduction rather than it. I haven't seen anything which talks about other options. Now, in the Republic, one of the things that was done was that everyone in the public sector had their pay cut by a certain percent. It was 10%, wasn't it, the Croke Park Agreement? But then, in the private sector, one of the things that they did during the recession, the Honda factory, for example, put everyone from whose work, they just stopped having a nighttime shift. And so you reduce the amount. Instead of running the factory 24 hours a day, they just run it 12 hours a day. So you had a single shift instead of two. So, you know, I don't know to what extent maybe the committee might want to explore whether other things have been considered. You know, maybe it makes more sense in terms of the economy, not to make a large number of people redundant, but instead to say, right, okay, instead of working 37.5 hours a week, which you're currently contracted for, you should do 35 or 30 or whatever. And whether those various options will be factored into the head of the Civil Services plan, because there may be that, you know, when you look at the economic impact of one policy over another, there might be a more preferable option.
There figure been set as to what the head count, what they would like to reduce the head count by yet?
No, I don't think so.
That's what we're just saying.
Not aware of one, no.
I had asked the Minister about his plans on that, and he said at the time that they were looking at that and they hadn't been developed as yet.
I mean, presumably, Chair, there's a couple of things you're going to need with the best, which may be the barrier to some of the other suggestions to be fair as well. Presumably they're going to have to work something reasonably satisfactory with the unions, for example, something that can be lived with. And I suspect, for example, I mean, one of the things you mentioned in terms of the Republic was a 7% pay cut across the board. Can't imagine the unions necessarily buying into that as an option, to be honest, and they prefer redundancy on it. But I suspect the other bit in terms of the overall headcount is, to some extent, I suppose, one of the bits is presumably DFP or the Minister, whereas he's responsible for the overall civil service side of things on it. I think the idea is this is looking
at the wider public sector, absolutely.
So I think a lot of that may also be dependent upon what level of feedback will be coming in from other departments and other ministers to say, well, actually, you know, we can afford to lose 500 or 1,000 people or 200 people or whatever it is. Really, to be honest, if a voluntary scheme went beyond that, we would get ourselves in difficulties in terms of being able to deliver our functions, or, well, you know, so I suspect a lot of that will be dependent upon what level of appetite there is within different departments. I suspect it's not just going to be a monetary figure that's going to be said, well, it's going to be X amount and here's your share of that, now, you know, go and do that type of thing. You know. But again, I suppose we can split that with the mouse.
Okay, Leslie.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, you know, this whole capital to revenue switch, we've been talking about this for years, and it has been done, in fact, in the past. We're still waiting, really, to get direct, you know, positive feedback from the Minister here on the, say it's 200 million, still at the discretion of the Treasury. Those previous ones, Colin, not certainly, were they all one-offs, or was there no sort of precedent established?
I'm not aware of any precedent of capital to revenue switches.
There were quite a few in agriculture, I remember.
Were there?
At one stage, yeah.
Yeah, I certainly hadn't. I mean, all of the Treasury's guidance suggests very much that it's the other way, rather, you know, and in fact, I think I put it in the paper here about Gordon Brown's golden rule, you know, that really the borrowing should only really be for the purposes of investment in infrastructure, not for paying your costs, you know.
I don't really respect Gordon Brown much, or certainly his golden rule. His golden rule was to sell off the gold reserves at the lowest possible price and direct the private pension.
Well, yeah, that was an issue indeed. No, there's certainly been a fair amount of discussion in various forums about the golden rule. But I can go in and look, for example. I mean, ultimately, it's down to the Treasury to say if they want to say so, they can. You know, but it's just I just think it would be good for the committee to try and seek some assurance from the Minister that he thinks this is going to be allowed.
Yeah,
you know.
fair comment.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chair.
Yeah. Thank you, Leslie. Pamela, can I ask you, I think you did the paper on preventative spending and change fund and so on.
I
That's
did.
set around 30 million. Do you think that's ambitious enough to lead to the type of savings in the longer term that would be beneficial?
The short answer is I don't really know at the moment. You know, it's hard to say what sort of bids are actually going to come in for departments to utilise that fund. And obviously, as we're doing the training on the budget process, we're trying to encourage committees to discuss with the departments what potential bids they could put in and how to access ideas for that sort of funding. Because I think from my own paper, I think if you can remember right, previously a lot of the bids were for voluntary redundancies under the Invest to Save, and I got the information actually in last week on Invest to Save from the department, which I'm collating and going to give to the committee. The short answer is I just don't know, because there's a lot of good ideas out there, but whether they can be promoted in the short term and used is a different thing altogether.
There's an American Nobel laureate in economics, James Heckman. I don't know if you've ever come across his work. Will it be possible to have maybe some idea of the type of proposals that he has for
David?
James Heckman?
James
I think his name
Heckman?
is, yeah.
Okay.
He seems to be, to specialise in this area of preventative spending. I think I mentioned the previous meeting, investment in early years education and the long-term saving there was from it. So it would be worth maybe looking at some of his other papers as well.
Yes, well, I can certainly look into that for you. But I think one thing that I did go into on preventative expenditure was the fact that really it's not just to sort of concentrate on early years, because preventative expenditure can go into any area,
No, but that's only an example I was using,
But certainly in Scotland, there's been great strides taken in the justice area, and they've invested it back into the communities to try and sort out different. I think sometimes the early years is something that people focus on and they don't think wider, which is what we've been trying to suggest to departments, in the training process, to think in as wide a terms as possible. To
But
sort
one
of
thing
bring in
about the
ideas.
early years, it does fan out, it does encompass health, education, justice system and so on. So it's not confined purely to education, though it has obvious educational benefits.
Yes.
Okay, Paul?
No,
Okay. Any other questions on any of the papers? Okay, well, thank you very much for your input this morning. I think it will probably be 11 o'clock before the minister is here. So with your permission, members, we will perhaps have a look at the correspondence at this stage. That's a good idea. So I'll ask the clerk to help us with that.
I'll just take members through it in a wee bit more maybe detail than sometimes. Each just highlights some pieces of correspondence just for noting, and maybe there's some decisions in respect of some of them as well. Page 85 of the pack. It's an update from the department on the district rate convergence issue and how the proposals are likely to pan out over the next 4-year term. So, giving a breakdown there in paragraph 3 of how that, in terms of 80%, 60, 40 and 20. Just draw that to members' attention at this stage, but I know there's a keen interest amongst members on that particular issue, but the officials will be up on 2 weeks' time, Chair, on the 10th of December, on rating issues, small business rate relief, and also on district convergence. So this is just an update in the meantime. Then, on a kind of a related issue as well, there's correspondence at page 123 of the pack, short letter from the department. The committee had raised this issue about rating of online retailers. It's actually an issue that rating specialists are also considering as well. And there's some points that the department does highlight there in terms of, difficulties around it and the potential for duplication and so forth. So again, the department is giving it wider consideration, and as part of the whole issue of when the new non-domestic taxation comes into play next year. So,
are there any examples of that or something similar to it taking place elsewhere?
Chair, we're not aware of it. From memory, the department provided a report from the Large Retailers Association and GB, but again, it seemed to highlight difficulties. So it's maybe an area that research could look at, Chair.
Yeah.
In terms of other jurisdictions internationally.
Were members interested in getting the paper on that?
Chair, I think that would be helpful. I mean, I think if you think about it, I can understand entirely why this is going to be sitting there. It's going to be very fraught with difficulties. But if you think about it, that on any sort of, if you talk to any retailers, if you go through any people who are sort of experts in the field or have a hands-on interest, I mean, they'll say that obviously the online stuff is year on year is increasing and eating into, whether it be a town centre or even, to be honest, some of the retail centres now. I think whereas the balance to be struck in terms of these things is we want to create a situation where I think one of the things we should be saying, particularly even to the current sort of retailers, is look, one area that you can expand your activities is by way of online. So we don't want to create something which effectively discourages them in that regard, but also then one which ensures there's not unfair competition. I think the other issue you've got to be careful of just with this, I suppose again where there needs to be a good deal of thought, we've got to have something then if you're applying rates that it's not a question of you're going to disadvantage, if you like, local companies by way of an imposition on them, but you may have great difficulty actually then not placing any degree of burden on somebody who is using effectively online from America or whatever that's using that as a sort of a device as well on it. So I think there's a lot of thought needs to be given to this, and I think the more information we have, because I suspect it's a subject that's going to come back to us quite a bit over the next few years.
And do you think it's worthwhile getting the paper?
Oh, very much so. I think we need to at least sort of see if we can sort of scope out where the live land some of these things are.
The members agreed that we commission a research paper on.
Yeah.
I think so, Chair. The big issue for me in this is that it's really to do with volume of sales. If you take it from the same jurisdiction, they're all paying rates. They're all paying with appropriate rates. So if someone actually has an online business as well, simply increasing the volume of their sales, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's where it may come from outside the jurisdiction where they're not paying rates at all. So there are two sort of scenarios, I believe, in this.
Well, it's worthwhile looking into.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, sure. I'll just highlight another piece of correspondence on page 130 of the pack. It's just follow-up issues that the department was responding to arising from a session that the committee had on business plan targets. But just notice, Chair, under office accommodation, this was an issue that the committee had identified as part of the flexible working inquiry, the potential for significant savings in consolidating government office accommodation, not just the NICS, which is only actually a small percentage of the overall public sector office accommodation, but across the board in terms of NDPBs, local government, etc. And that would be achieved through moving to modern workplace design, good practice workplace design in terms of open plan, and a consolidation of space, basically, and also through flexible location work and so forth. So, but I just noticed under the on page 133 there, the department mentions that the percentage of accommodation that DFP specifically occupies and which meets workspace utilisation targets is not available. So the department doesn't know itself what, what percentage of its own space is being utilised according to the targets. I think the committee received information during the inquiry to suggest that only 20% of overall NICS office accommodation was meeting utilisation targets, space utilisation targets. So it's just an area in terms of savings and overall potential for savings that the committee might, want to continue to look at. And then the other pieces of correspondence. There's page 134 of the pack. There's correspondence about the PSNI equal pay claim. It's from a member of the PSNI civilian staff, and the committee has been keenly interested in equal pay issues, including PSNI and the other issues as well. This person seems to have received correspondence from Sinn Féin and is asking this committee questions in relation to that, but this committee hasn't received that correspondence. So it's just really for advice from the committee on how we respond to that, in terms of, is the committee content, for example, to write back saying that it can't comment because it hasn't been copied into that correspondence. So members are happy enough for that approach.
Yes, Fiona?
Yeah, I'll check. I'm sure he has wrote, and I'm sure the party would have issued him with a response, but I'll check that out.
Okay, it's just in relation to this committee. Are members content to note that? Yes? Okay.
And Chair, at page 141 of the pack, there's correspondence from the Payments Council.
Yeah.
The committee received a briefing from the Payments Council recently, Chair, on the current account switch system.
Yes.
And it's now writing again about another service expansion of mobile payment service. It's called PAYM, and it's up and running with some banks, and some other banks are providing or joining the service as well. So it seems to be a more kind of joined up approach in terms of being able to make payments and online and so forth. So
Just what he did.
the Payments Council is offering the committee a written briefing if members are content enough to take that offer up in the meantime, in terms of more detail on the service. It may be useful in terms of constituency work and so forth.
Great. Okay.
Then, finally, Chair, on the correspondence, there's just an invite and from the chief officers of the third sector, and that's at page 148 of the pack. It's really just for members to get that invite extends to the full committee. So if members are, it's to a conference on the 19th, and leadership conference and awards dinner on the 19th and 20th of February in the Slieve Donard. So it's really just for members to consider individually and decide if they wish to take that up themselves. That's all the correspondence, Chair.
Okay. Thank you, Shane. So we still have about 8 minutes before the minister's due to be here. So we'll have a look at the forward work programme, if members are in agreement with that. Yes, Shane.
Okay, Chair, the programme, copy of the programme is at page 150 of the pack.
Yes.
It's just bringing the committee up to the Christmas recess. But there's a lot of business still to be scheduled after Christmas, and that's listed in a separate section there. In terms of next week's meeting, there's 2 sessions from DFE officials on fiscal powers, in terms of potential for devolution of further fiscal powers as arising from the commitment that was given in the Building a Prosperous and United Community document, and that's powers, fiscal powers other than corporation tax. So there's a session on that. That work has been ongoing within the department for a few months now, and the proposals the committee will be briefing the proposals next week. And then there's also a session next week on the potential for devolution of corporation tax, and members will be aware that's the day of the Chancellor's statement. So It's just to provide an update in terms of because the decision probably won't be public at that stage, but it may be useful in terms of providing members with an indication of the type of work that will be required should there be a positive decision. Type of work by the department and between the department and Treasury. There's also a session that was scheduled for today, which has had to be moved to next week because the briefing on the department's budget had to be postponed from last week to this week. So that's a session on the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development is undertaking a review of public governance in Northern Ireland. It's the first kind of regional exercise that OECD has undertaken, and there's an initial briefing for the committee in terms of the areas that that's going to cover that hopefully will be scheduled in for next week as well. The session on the validation study of welfare reform costs still has to be confirmed. We're not sure yet whether that will be available ready for next week or possibly have to be put back to the 10th. I have, Chair, been liaising with the Social Development Committee in terms of because there's a joint interest in that issue. So I'm waiting to hear back whether that committee wants to, to take briefing individually on this issue, or whether they wanted to propose a kind of a joint session on that. So that's a possibility for next week, or else on the 10th. The other session is in next week, and the provision at the moment is on public sector innovation labs. Again, Minister has spoken on this issue before, and there's been a number of pilot projects have been undertaken, so the committee can receive an update on that. Then on the 10th of December, there's in terms of the coordinated report on the draft budget, Chair, the plan is to have a draft for committee consideration on the 10th. Now, the staff are summarising the evidence and beginning drafting the report as we speak, as the evidence comes in. Other committees are due to respond to this committee by the 5th of December, Friday the 5th. Now, I have been receiving some informal feedback from other committee clerks to say that some of their committees haven't received briefings yet, or the briefings have been delayed and they may not make that deadline. So the issue about, in terms of whether it could be a completely coordinated report still is unclear, but the plan is to have a draft for the committee's consideration on the 10th. There may be a need to schedule an additional meeting at some point in terms of getting, if the committee needs more time to finalise the report. And then there's the issue, of course, of the take note debate. The committee had proposed for that to take place on the 10th or on the 8th, in order that the dual purpose, that debate primarily to give all Assembly members opportunity to debate the draft budget, because otherwise there isn't an opportunity for the full Assembly to debate it before the Executive agrees it. And secondly, it can also inform the coordinated report. So it's a very tight timescale in terms of getting this agreed by the committee, but that's the plan at this point in time. Then the other sessions on the 10th, outcome of the June monitoring round is to be confirmed, but that would normally take place around that time. Then, as I mentioned earlier, there's sessions on rating. The outcome of the Small Business Rate Relief Scheme policy evaluation that the Northern Ireland Centre for Economic Policy was undertaking. I received an informal update from the DFP officials yesterday to say that NICEP have completed their work and it has now gone to the Minister for consideration, and it should be made public within the next fortnight. And so the officials will be briefing the committee on that on the 10th. Also, they've agreed, arising from the committee's decision last week, to receive an update briefing on the non-domestic revaluation, and also the issues mentioned earlier of district rate convergence. So fairly full next couple of meetings, Chair, and lots of issues in terms of the new year as well. The bill, the Legal Complaints and Regulations Bill, is due to come to the committee in the new year as well. And there's also then, the committee also needs to continue to work on the review of the operation of the Barnett formula, and there's further expert evidence to be taken, and possibility of, the committee was giving some consideration to possibility of visits to maybe Scotland, Wales and Westminster and early in the new year as well, relating to that review in terms of meeting with counterparts and the work. There's ongoing reviews both by the executive side and by the legislative side in Scotland, and I think in Wales as well, that are relevant and connected to the whole issue of the Barnett formula. So it's from that regard, that's the work programme covered. Chair.
Okay. Thanks very much, Shane. Morning. Good morning. So we will now move on to item number 5 on the agenda, which is the ministerial briefing. And I'd like to warmly welcome the Minister here this morning. Very welcome, Minister. And also Mike Brennan, Budget Director. Minister, do you want to make a short statement, or do you feel you've said enough already? Or can we go straight into questions?
I think both things are accurate, Chair. Thank you for the invitation to be back. I didn't expect to be back maybe just as soon after my last appearance. In fact, after the last appearance, given that I think it was here for about 2.5 hours, I didn't think I would ever get an invite back from the committee. As you say, Chair, I'm joined by Mike Brennan, who is our Budget Director in DFP and very familiar to the committee. And whenever questions get too difficult and too technical, he will be the man who will field those for me, I'm sure, which will be probably most of them. Look, as you know, I do want to speak just very, very briefly, if I may, Chair. I mean, I think everybody understands how challenging the budget position was for the 15-16 year. We've got a sense of how difficult it was going to be in this year, 14-15. And I think we all knew and all anticipated that next year was always going to be very, very tough, primarily and principally on the Resourcedale side of the House. We had a 1.6% real terms reduction in Resourcedale for 15-16. And that has followed a trend over the last number of years where around £1.5 billion of our spending power as an executive has been denied to us because the block grant hasn't kept pace with inflation. And this isn't a sort of a one-off or a few years. We may have expected some time ago that this year or next year we would be coming to an end, towards an end of the policy of austerity, but obviously the economy has not grown in the way that the government anticipated, and all of the projections provided by the Office of Budget Responsibility in London would suggest that at a UK-wide level, Resourcedale expenditure will reduce by a further 13% in real terms by the 18-19 financial year. And that's a considerable amount of money, and whilst we're not sure at this stage what that actually will mean for Northern Ireland, it will depend on a number of strategic decisions taken by the next government in their comprehensive spending review. But if it was a 13% reduction, that would be a further £1 billion taking out of our spending power by the end of this decade. In trying to craft a budget for 15-16, it's always difficult. I think any executive, no matter what the financial circumstances, to craft a budget made it a little bit more difficult by the sort of system that we are operating in with 5 parties in the executive. But made even more complicated by the significant pressures the executive was facing moving into 15-16. And those pressures are all well known to this committee. There are a range of executive commitments, so things like the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry and various executive funds that were sitting as pressures. There was the need to repay the £100 million loan facility that was got from Treasury with the agreement of the Chancellor for this financial year. There were employer pension costs and a pressure, and a sizable pressure in that regard that has started to develop. And then there were the sort of very well publicised departmental pressures, particularly in the likes of health. That necessitated, to deal with those pressures, which amounted to £872 million, that necessitated an across the board, with the exception of health, cut of 15.1% to allow us to make a series of allocations of around 659 million, because the net The net reduction was 213. So some of the media have publicised 872 as a figure that of cuts, and I still see some people referring to 872 million of cuts. The net reduction is actually 213, which is still sizable, but thankfully not as bad as 872. In those allocations, we sought to prioritise, as you would expect us to do, key public services. So departments like health, with their well-publicised pressures and universal and across-the-board support for the health budget, they have got an allocation and an increase in their allocation for the next financial year of £150 million. The impressive job creation record, which DETI and Invest Northern Ireland have been able to achieve, is supported by an increase in their spend for next year in a draft budget of 5.3%. And a degree of protection, although not full protection, is offered to other key frontline services like the Department of Education and policing within the Department of Justice. And there are a range of other smaller but nonetheless important legal, contractual and inescapable pressures that are also met in that allocation of around £650 million in the draft budget. Chairman, it was an incredibly tough budget. It is going to be an incredibly tough budget. It's incredibly tough to agree. It will be very difficult and very challenging in its execution. And I have been stressing to ministers in the meetings that I've been having with them. I'm through about a third of the bilaterals with fellow ministers. I've been stressing to them the importance of, just as the executive as a whole, has prioritised what it defines as key public services. It's important for ministers themselves within their own departmental allocations to prioritise what they consider to be the key services within their department, and at all times seeking to protect us so far as they can, frontline delivery of those services. Just briefly on the capital side of the budget, it is up slightly. It would have been up further but for a series of decisions, I think essential decisions that were taken by the executive. One around the use of capital receipts to repay the £100 million loan facility, and the other, the use of at least part £100 million, half of our RRI borrowing capacity for next year to pay for a workforce, the early stages of a workforce restructuring plan and a voluntary exit scheme for public servants. So our capital budget, which is still up, would have been up further but for those decisions that were taken. I think the brighter spot within the capital budget, and perhaps one of the brighter spots in the whole budget, is the creation of an investment fund, a Northern Ireland Investment Fund, which we are working through in terms of feasibility studies at the minute to look at the areas in which that might be deployed. But this is Mr. Cree will be very pleased to hear, will use and utilise we anticipate a significant amount of financial transactions capital in the next number of years, but won't just utilise that, but will also be able to leverage in the first instance, we estimate around £1 billion worth of additional investment from the European Investment Bank. So by the end of this, we will have a £1 billion, at least £1 billion investment fund for infrastructure projects, the sort of infrastructure projects that we as a government support but don't always take forward in the way that we do with, say, roads projects or schools projects or hospital projects. So I think that's something that I'm sure the committee and indeed others will welcome. Chair, I would never pretend that this was a perfect budget. In the circumstances we found ourselves in, it couldn't be a perfect budget. You cannot have a situation where you're facing 1.6% real terms reductions, the effect of that then being £213 million being taken out of public spending. You can't have that sort of situation and it have everybody a winner and nobody a loser. What it does do as a budget is that it presents us with a balanced budget with no overcommitment. It does prioritise key public services, and it begins to prepare us and have us ready for the very tough times that are ahead. And in examining this 15-16 draft budget, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, and whilst we will talk about the year that it has an impact on, rightly so, we should see it as the beginning of something of a different era in public spending in Northern Ireland. And whilst we might have, as I said earlier, been expecting to become coming out of more difficult times in public spending, it's very clear that irrespective of who forms, which party or parties form the next administration in London, that tighter, difficult times are going to be the new norm in terms of public spending in the UK, and therefore the consequences of that on Northern Ireland. So it's a very challenging, very difficult budget. There are a range of difficult issues that the executive have had to grapple with in it, but I think it is one, whilst it is not perfect, that will put us on the right path, not just to prosperity, but to sounder public finances. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Just a few points that arose during the meeting earlier on in relation to the repayment of the 100 million loan from the reserve. You've said that you're going to use capital receipts to pay back that loan. There was a question, has the Treasury agreed to transferring those capital funds to revenue?
There's no agreement, no formal agreement has been received yet. I have corresponded with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury requesting that two flexibilities. The flexibility that you're talking about, Chair, in terms of capital receipts to repay the loan facility, £100 million loan facility, and also the ability to use £100 million of our RRI borrowing to start a voluntary exit scheme as part of our workforce restructuring plan. So I request that short, and around the time the draft budget was agreed, I corresponded with the Chief Secretary requesting those, and we're still in discussions with him in respect of receiving those, but we're proceeding on the basis that whilst they are requesting flexibility, particularly on the RRI one, it isn't novel in that we have used it before for non-capital expenditure around the PMS and indeed the equal pay claim a number of years ago as well. So that one isn't novel or contentious in any way, or it shouldn't be, it ought not to be. The other one obviously is a little bit more not what the Treasury would be used to be doing, but I think the point that I would make to the Chief, and have made to the Chief Secretary and will continue to make to him as I have conversations with him, is that if you look at the budget situation, it is a very difficult, as I said before, it's a very difficult, very challenging budget already. And without that flexibility and therefore the need to repay that loan from our resource deal, which is where the pressure is, without that flexibility, then we take a very challenging situation and you make it pretty much impossible. You know, I think that without that flexibility, it would be incredibly hard, if not impossible, to agree a final budget, because we would be going to the final budget stage in a month or so's time, trying to find £100 million more of reductions. And I would say to anybody in this committee, I would say to the Chief Secretary as well, where do you find that £100 million from within a budget which does have, for many departments, including my own, very serious reductions to face? So, we continue to, and I remain optimistic. I'm always optimistic, as you know. I remain optimistic that we will get those flexibilities.
You're optimistic. Are you confident?
Yeah, well, look, I think whenever the Chief Secretary looks at it, I mean, whilst it might be something that ordinarily they wouldn't do or permit, I think in the circumstances, and whenever they're looking, if you reflect back on the letter from the Chancellor, whenever the £100 million loan was agreed, he wanted a credible, balanced budget and a credible plan. We have a balanced budget and we have the beginnings of a credible plan in terms of workforce restructuring. So our flexibilities that we're asking for to be able to use capital receipts, and I wouldn't have, capital use of capital receipts, and we had already identified £108 million of clearly achievable capital receipts to repay the loan. Using that allows it to be a balanced budget and an agreed balanced budget. And the use of the flexibilities on the RRI borrowing allows us to start a credible plan. So what we are asking for in terms of flexibilities from the Treasury actually allows us to have a balanced budget and a credible plan, which is what they requested a number of months ago.
Now, you said there that the 100 million from capital receipts, that does reduce the capital side of things.
Yeah.
But the use of RRI borrowing, which is generally designed for capital investment. The use of it for voluntary redundancy, does that not further lessen the capital side of things again?
Yes, it does. Strictly speaking, it does. Yeah, we have £100 million less being spent on capital budget. But you know, this is the situation we find ourselves in, where when you have a very difficult budget and you have to seek agreement across the board, you have to take some very difficult decisions, and there are tough choices in front of you. And you know, as I've already said, to have repaid the loan out of our resource deal would have meant that we were finding a further £100 million of cuts on top of the 213 that are already happening. And you know, I can tell you from conversations already with ministers, I don't get a sense that there's much more that they can find. Ministers I've spoken so far are all ministers who are facing reductions in their spending. And I think the idea of going back to them and saying, well, by the way, you've been planning for 5 or 8 or 10% reductions, but now the figure is actually higher than that again. I don't think I'll get a terrible lot of sympathy from those ministers. And in fact, actually, I think you move from a position where you have a very difficult budget, but an achievable one in terms of, you know, I think we can live within our means next year, even though it's very difficult, to one where you actually can't, and one where it's just undeliverable if we have to find another 100 million. So that necessitates a choice between, I don't know if I've got permission from the Treasury, notwithstanding, where we had a choice to make, and I think it was better in the round. Ideally, you wouldn't be doing it. Of course, you wouldn't be doing it. But ideally you wouldn't be doing it. But in the circumstances we found ourselves in, I think it was the right decision to take, and not unprecedented. We have used it before, as I said, large, principally on the Presbyterian Mutual situation, where it was used. We were able to capitalise those costs, and we did it with equal pay as well. So it's not unprecedented, and that's why I'm very optimistic and confident that we will get that flexibility from Treasury, because we've done it before. And the truth is, we in order to make savings both in next year and to get people really ready for very difficult years to come, we need to start somewhere, finding money somewhere to structure our workforce. And again, if that hadn't been, we hadn't been using, or we didn't propose to use RRI, then we'd have to find it from resource deal as well somewhere. And that again would have made the pressures just insurmountable.
Well, you have made it clear that you intend to look at the public service workforce and the reduction of the headcount within the public service workforce. Can I ask you how much work has been done on that to date, and has there been any consultation with the trade unions on that?
There's significant work behind the scenes going. I mean, we are talking about, in a very short period of time, getting in place a voluntary exit scheme, which in itself then can lower our headcount, not just in the civil service, but across the whole public sector, by considerable numbers. So there's a lot of work going on in the background to try to get this ready, and I will present it to the executive very shortly, I hope, in the form of a reform and restructuring plan, which will, yes, look at reducing the headcount, but we'll also look at a range of other areas in the whole personnel area, but also some other opportunities that I think that there are for easy wins in terms of saving money. In case anybody was wondering what's an easy win in saving money, I'm talking about things like the better use and greater use of our shared services that we have operate through our department. And there are still some arm's length bodies who don't avail of and use those shared services, and I think this is now an opportunity for everybody to get on board on that, and therefore reduce their costs and help to reduce everybody's cost. But there's a lot of work going on. My understanding is that there have been early discussions with trade unions on it. It's hard to get in. I mean, the fine detail is not there yet, and there are a lot of careful consideration. A lot of careful consideration has to be given to large aspects. It's not simply a matter of like how much money have you, how many people can you remove, and who are the first X number of 100 or 1,000 people who put their hand up. You have to be a lot more careful than that. And this will
Is
be...
have you any indication of the range of grades that will be included in the scheme?
Well, there's no targeting of particular grades, and there's no targeting of particular... One thing I will say, and again, drawing on the discussions that I've had with 4 ministerial colleagues so far, and I can add myself to this as well, there is not a minister that I have spoken to, and this goes across parties, who is not saying to me that they will have surplus headcount that they want to remove, both in their department, so in civil service, but also in their arm's length bodies, or education and library boards and things like that as well. So there isn't a minister who isn't saying to me that they don't want a workforce restructuring plan in place and a voluntary exit scheme there. And there isn't one of them who isn't saying that they want to access the funds that we will have available at the centre to do that. But we're not quite in the position yet, and we won't be for some time actually, in terms of the finer detail about who is going, what grade they're going, and the exact numbers and what areas they're going. Because I think one of the things that we are doing as a department at the minute is talking to other departments about what is the number that they think that they will need to take out. And you will find very, very quickly, once you add all of those up, that will be more than we will be able to afford in the first year.
What is the timescale?
Well, again, that will depend. It will depend on 2 things. It will depend on hollowing out with ministers how much personnel they wish to take out of their departments and their arm's length bodies want to take out. So that's the first factor, and then the second is how much money we have, and whether we get the flexibility with our RRI borrowing or not, and indeed get that perhaps for future years as well. I mean, we have suggested £100 million for next year. I think actually in reality it will probably cost more than that, and I think it will go into further years as well, because you can't, in practical terms, you can't take, if the number is a big number, you can't take a big number out in 1 year, in terms of the impact that it would have on services. So graduating it over a period of time is probably the more sensible way to do it. But at this stage, I couldn't say whether it's going to be 2 or 3 years or even more.
And can you say what is the extent of the discussions that you have had with the unions around this?
Well, funny enough, on the day after the draft budget was announced, well, I was going to say announced formally in the House, not announced informally in various newspapers. It was, I had a meeting with ICTU, which was arranged anyway, but obviously there's a lot of focus on the draft budget. It came up in discussions with them. It wasn't the only topic of conversation that we had, and I think that they understand that in the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and whilst they have their interest and they will fight for their members' interests, and I would hope too that they would fight for the broader public service interest. I think there is a realism there, and I think we're all realistic. Nobody really wants to do this. You wouldn't want to wake up in the morning and say this is the sort of thing that you want to do, but in the circumstances, it's a necessity. And there have been discussions at official level with trade unions as well, and so they're not being kept in the dark in any way about it. They're fully informed, and obviously have a role to play in the whole process.
Okay. Martin.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Minister, for coming in. Certainly, I'm confident, whatever your confidence, I'm confident that you have managed to bring all the different parties in the executive table behind the budget, but we also are aware there's a really serious consultation process going on at the minute, large public response, and I'm confident as well that between now and the budget being agreed, we can make some changes which may ease the pain, in particular in relation to the arts and the further education. I'm new to this, of course, but you'll forgive me for not reading the speech before I was elected to this august body, but any speech which has Mandela in there, as well as JFK, there has to be something right about it. But two issues I wanted to discuss. One is the Change Fund. And, I think we're all sympathetic to the idea that we should set money aside for projects which will reduce expenditure in the time ahead and help us to do things in a wiser manner. But I wonder, given the short period that the departments have to bid for this money, given, I'm sure, the temptation among departments to actually bid for monies which will replace monies they're losing, is it not possible to take some money from the Change Fund now to make it a smaller Change Fund and to give some relief, I suppose, to our friends in the in Decal and Dale. Just before you answer that, Minister, maybe you could just rehearse the two figures that you give at the start. One was for the extent of the cuts going forward in real terms. I think it was 1.5 billion, and the extent of the reduction in the Treasury block grant, I think in the last 4 years. I think that may have been 1 billion as well. But if you give me those two figures first, because I'm very aware of the pressures you're under.
If you go back, the real terms reduction in year for 15-16 was 1.6%. In terms of lost spending power, so not keeping pace with the block grant, not keeping pace with inflation, it's around 1.5 billion has been lost between 11 and 15. With actually the sequencing of that later and later in that period, so that's why this year, compared to previous years in the 11 to 15 budget, has been more difficult. Moving forward, the projections are, again, this is a real terms figure. It's 13%. I think it's sort of roughly, was it 5, 5 and 3, I think is the sequencing of that over the next 3 years. Now that's a real terms reduction. So it's over the, so it's 3 point, so it's a significant amount over that period, and that's at a UK-wide level. Now, an incoming administration of whatever political hue could take a different decision. You could see decisions taken to protect various areas of public spending in England, which would have positive Barnett consequences for Northern Ireland. But I think no matter what administration it is and what policy decisions they take in terms of spending, you're looking at reductions in spending in the block grant as well. If it was the full 13%, it's going to be around another £1 billion roughly out of our spending by the end of the decade. And that's a lot. You take that over a decade. It's a budget of, started off as a budget of over 10 billion in terms of resource expenditure, now down below 10 billion. And you're talking, real prospect of another total £1 billion coming off it. That's a lot of money for a little place like Northern Ireland to shed in a relatively short period of time. In terms of the change fund and how that might be used, now the intention, I've had this feedback, I have to say, from some ministers, Chair, where they said, well, could you not just use the 30 million and spread that out across departments? It's a small amount of money, you can't do a terrible lot. It'd be better just, carving that up. Now, if it was to carve that up amongst all of the departments, there'd be someone, you'd have, Health would nearly get 15 million of it. I'm sure Jim would bite my arm off for that, but he would get nearly 15 million. Education would get around 3 to 4, Justice would get around 3 to 4, and the rest would get tuppence halfpenny nearly, So for some it wouldn't make a huge amount of difference to their bottom line. It wouldn't shift their percentage reduction a terrible lot. I could make a case, for, instead of it being 30 million, that it should actually be higher than that. Because at a time whenever you're facing, I made this clear to ministers during negotiations around this, discussions around this, that at a time whenever you're facing reduced expenditure, that's whenever there's a temptation sometimes to just say, well, look, I've got a 5% cut, everything across the board is cut by 5%. Ministers need to look more critically, both in terms of reprioritising within their own budget and also sometimes stopping some things that they're doing. Because there are things that departments do that aren't working anymore, that have failed, that are only achieving some of their outcomes, and there is perhaps a better way to do it. Now, finding the better way to do something isn't always just as easy as turning one thing off and turning another thing on. It requires an investment. And that's what the Change Fund is about. It's also about early intervention and prevention. It's also about trying to, and this is something I've particularly learned over the last 18 months that I've been in post, that there are a lot of areas where we are getting very, very poor outcomes. And often, not always, but often the reason we're getting very, very poor outcomes is that no one single department takes ownership of the problem. So the problem might manifest itself initially in one department, but resolving it there has an outcome somewhere else. So neither department really wants to take the load in terms of paying for that. So one of the criteria on the Change Fund is that it should also encourage collaboration between departments, because I found it difficult to get, say, I'm just using it as an example, justice and education to work together on something, or health and justice to work together on something. whenever they're all facing pressures, they've all got less money. And if you just give them more money, they'll spend it on their own stuff rather than things that produce better outcomes across the board. So there are criteria, strict criteria going to be applied to the change fund. If those criteria are not met by the quality of the bids, and I accept that there is a weakness in the change fund in this sense, that there's a very short period of time for departments to come forward with bids. I still think it is a good idea, and I hope that everybody would agree that in principle it is a good idea. But if we do not get the quality of bids coming forward in the next number of weeks, then we'll obviously have to look at other options with it. I wouldn't be yet in the position to say where, you know, I don't think I'm glad I share your optimism on many things, Marcin. I'm not maybe as optimistic that we will have bags of cash between now, appearing between draft and final budget, that will allow us to sort of spread that out and ease a lot of the pressures. There may be some. I hope that there will be. Just saying, it's going to be incredibly difficult and not obvious to see where that is coming from. We mentioned universities, and I met with the Dell Minister yesterday and had a very, very good conversation. And I've said publicly that I have some sympathy for the position that he finds himself in. I don't want to go into why he finds himself in the position that he is in, but it is, I have to say, the settlement within the budget that I am least satisfied with for a range of reasons. And now I think there's a lot of work that universities can and should be doing themselves. You know, they're not paupers by any means, and we are trying to actively work with that sector. On the arts issue, again, I'm aware of the issues that are around that, and again, it's a matter for the Minister herself to, if she values the arts budget, and she is facing 10% reductions as well. And it's going to be incredibly difficult for her not to offer some pain to that sector. But it is as much a matter for what are her priorities within her own departmental spend. Is it libraries? Is it arts? Is it what is it? But it's a very good example of the difficult decisions that all ministers have to make in terms of prioritising within their budgets, which are being constrained.
Since it was a long answer, Minister, I mean, I just to finish, I suppose one of the dangers of this austerity agenda is that it hits confidence, that it stops people investing, that it stops people spending, and so on. It's a danger that we face when we have to cope with really straightened budgets, and that's one of the reasons why I do think those two areas, it really does amount to preventative spending. When you hit the arts, I think you hit tourism, you hit cultural uplift, you hit confidence in the city, and if we have to reduce the number of students, and you know the debate goes on, I think that would be difficult for investors to say we're still coming in when the universities can't produce these top class business oriented or engineering students for us. So it's in the area of preventive spend, but I take on board what you're saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, thanks, Marcin. Adrian.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Minister, for what you've said so far. I was going to ask you about the change fund as well, but I was coming at it from the other side. I was going to say it's 30 million not a bit tight in that there, and we need more put into that there to help to drive change forward. But I'll ask you about rebalancing the economy.
Yeah.
You know, it's 9.6 of a deficit, 6 billion of a deficit there now at the minute. You know, how can we reduce that there other than corporation tax? And, you know, and it's a long-term plan.
Yeah. But I said in my budget statement, which Marcin, having only recently read it, should be best versed in, maybe probably better versed in it than I am now, that even though we are in very, very difficult time, we face into very, very challenging times in terms of our public spending, I am perhaps more confident that we are able to do what we are proposing to do in terms of say, for example, reducing the size of the workforce within the public sector. Because if you were trying to do this 5, 7 or 10 years ago, with the economy in the state that it would have been at that time, well, it's okay, the economy actually would have been doing pretty well, but it was almost a false well with a property bubble sort of being the main drive of economic growth at that time. It might have been more difficult, but if you look at where we are economically today, we're in a stronger position. I'm not saying we're very, very strong. We're not. There is a huge subvention still annually, but we're in a better position with an economy that is growing. Small growth, but larger. Small growth last year, but bigger growth this year and next year. Invest Northern Ireland has just come out of its a record year in its lifetime in terms of jobs promoted. It's already exceeded what it did last year already this year. So I am optimistic and I'm confident that we're in a better position to do what we're having to do. It's still going to be incredibly tough, and Martin's right. There's going to be sapping of some confidence because of what happens in terms of public spending. But I do think we're in a more robust position than we are. But we're not robust enough. And we need to, on the one hand, whilst we are going to have to reform and restructure our public sector, we always need to make sure that we don't lose sight as well of the need to make interventions and policy decisions that are all about rebalancing our economy. Now, our economy will somewhat rebalance with less public spending and perhaps significant numbers of public servants no longer being employed. But that's not the type of rebalancing we want to see our economy grow, and obviously we still remain firm to the position that we believe the corporation tax, while it's not a silver bullet, is the best lever, the one that will have the most transformational effect on our economy. And obviously the committee's aware that, well, this time next week, we should be, maybe not quite this time, maybe slightly later in the day, we should have I hope, a positive decision in respect of corporation tax. Now, there's obviously a lot of work that has to go on beyond that. And the positive effects of corporation tax being reduced won't be immediately felt after next year. We're not going to wake up on Thursday and start having all of those benefits. And a lot of work and a lot of effort have to be put in.
Should help near enough straight away.
Well, I think once the executive does what it needs to do in terms of taking a decision on what rate it wants to lower it to, you will then start to see investment starting to flow in anticipation of the rate being lower. But I do still think that you're right. We mustn't lose sight of the need to continue to work towards rebalancing our economy. It is our number one objective as an executive. It's something that I think we have been successful at, and we've got to keep at it.
Can I just ask Dan, do you think it's possible to balance the economy without hitting frontline services? Can we do both?
I think it's going to be, can't strip £213 million out. I mean, I'm trying to be as honest as I possibly can with the public, that you cannot take out £213 million from your budget, around 2% of our resource expenditure, and it not change the shape and nature of our public sector. It's bound to. What we've got to try to do, and I think what the draft budget does achieve, is that it minimises that in those areas which the public themselves would prioritise. So that's health and creating jobs and continuing to try to rebalance the economy. And it's in education, and it's in policing. I think that most people would agree that whilst everything is important, there are some things that are a little bit more important, and those are the areas that we have sought to prioritise. But there will be an effect on the nature and size and shape of the public sector, and it's important that ministers, and it's going to be incredibly difficult for them, try to insulate frontline services and key frontline services within their own department, or important preventative services or whatever it might be within their own departments. But I understand and appreciate that that's not always going to be possible, and that there are going to be, and I said in response to Martin, that there are some services, I think, which are going to have to be stopped, because, not just stop because of no money, but stop because they're not producing outcomes anymore. I mean, that's a critical criteria that has to be applied.
Okay, thanks, Adrian. John?
Thanks, Chair, Minister. Around the headcount issue and reducing it, have you any concerns as to, that you could hollow out certain government departments, particularly the one I would think of obvious that I have a big concern about would be if you moved ARD up to Ballykelly, the people that you could lose an expertise there that actually people up out of that
you think people like
they can't travel.
Believe for some people they have to travel to work.
I'm thinking of people from actually Strangford South Down that travel to it. You could lose an expertise. Is that, and that could happen right across government, is that a concern for you?
Obviously, a decision has been taken in terms of DARD and the relocation to Ballykelly, and that's again, like a lot of these things, it's not something that's happening overnight. There's time to plan and prepare and make sure that we get it right. A lot of work has to be done on it's not my department taking this forward, obviously, but there's a lot of work, obviously we're involved, but there's a lot of work required on site before you'd even be anywhere near thinking of moving even bits of the departmental HQ up towards Ballykelly. I say that, like, I am not against what is sometimes described as a decentralisation of posts. I think you've got to do it carefully. You know, like to your point, it can be costly as well to do it. With sometimes sort of dubious benefits economically for the area that you're located in. Although it's interesting, the Irish halted their large-scale decentralisation plan because they'd ran out of money. But recent studies showed that I think that it actually did have a marginal economic benefit for the areas into which the jobs were moved, and overall for the whole of Ireland. Look, I think the point that you make is a sensible point around workforce restructuring. There could be seen to be a haste, and departments are going to have to be careful. I mean, I've had some discussions already with ministers, as I've said, where they have all identified rough numbers of people that they need to lose in order to live within their means. Not next year, because it's important that even if a scheme is in place as quickly as it possibly can be, it's unlikely, to realise significant savings for departments next year. So I've been cautioning ministers not to rely on savings but materialising next year. But this is about preparing for beyond. This is part of our credible plan, our reform and restructuring plan for beyond, for dealing with the potential loss of a further £1 billion to our budget. So there are a lot of work to be done. But I would, it'll not all happen at one go, because we won't be able to afford it. But we won't be able to afford it in terms of exactly the point that you're making. You can't just go in and take out, if a department wants to lose 200 staff, you can't go in and take out the first 200 people to put their hand up. There has to be an assessment around skill set, what areas are working in. You know, you could have, let's take for example a unit of 10 people where 7, and it's a key area, and 7 people put their hand up and say they want to go, and you hollow that out and there's only 3 people left and you can't provide the service to the same standard anymore. So you've got to be careful about how it's done, and that work will go on once the executive agrees to proceed in this. And I think we will agree to proceed. Certainly the feedback from ministers so far is that they're anxious to get a scheme going very, very quickly. Then it will almost go dark for a while in terms of that type of work being done, assessing who can go and what's the impact on service delivery if certain types of numbers of people go, and what's the cost of, because every individual will have a different cost associated to them in terms of their pensions and so forth as well. So there's a lot of work will go on behind the scenes over the sort of next 6 months at making sure sort of the situation that you're talking about actually doesn't happen.
Thanks, Chair. In the corporation tax, probably been on presentations to this committee that talked about you would almost need the borrowing powers as well to go along with that, in case obviously if tax receipts go down, some years you might have to borrow, or you could be left with a hole in the budget to fill. I mean, even in the RRI budget, I mean, it's over half of that's nearly been used on workforce restructuring. Are you even content that we're making the best use out of the RRI? Are we using it too much to borrow to plug holes in other areas rather than say invest in capital schemes or expenditure?
Well, look, we've already borrowed, I think, used about, I think it's 1.8 billion roughly of our RRI. And the vast bulk of that has gone on capital projects, which otherwise wouldn't have been built, and we could provide a list of identifying which ones have been funded from it. In some ways it's immaterial what has been funded and what hasn't been funded, that's the total package has in terms of our capital, but and it's been particularly helpful over the last couple of years, because if you reflect back to 2011, the area of the budget that was under pressure in 2011 was capital, and the executive between draft and final budget in 2010 into 2011 was scrambling around looking for more sources of capital and switching money from revenue to capital and all that sort of thing. So over the last number of years, having the ability to put in another £200 million to it's actually higher than that now annually, with the economic pact allowing us to borrow for shared education, shared housing projects, has been very welcome boost to what was a pretty weak capital budget over the early part of this budget period. You're right. We are at the same as the chair's point. We're proposing to use half of it next year. We are getting very, very close to a ceiling in terms of our RRI, and in regards to what it is. You can continue to borrow and borrow for forever, but there's a cost, obviously, in terms of interest repayments on it. Where we are at the minute is, and I've given advice to the executive around this, that we've just got to be careful in terms of the repayment cost and all of this, and see that'll be a factor too in terms of how much we borrow to pay for our workforce restructuring plan, because it is it's about 60 million or something annually we're paying in terms
63
of 63 million, yeah, in interest every year, and that's coming out of a resource budget which is under pressure. But no, I'm confident that we have got good value out of it. It has been a helpful, useful device over the last couple of years, particularly because of our capital budget being weak. But if we are able to, and I anticipate that we will be able to use it for workforce restructuring, it means that, yes, there's less for capital, but it means that where the pressure is at the minute, Resourcedale has not hit any more than it should be.
And just around corporation tax, how would you handle that if receipts fail? Or I'm assuming you're going to be entering into that fairly cautiously if you're still the minister, and as to when you would reduce, getting the power, but over into 2017, 2018, by the time you would have the ability to use that, managing that in that time, how?
I mean, if we get, and I anticipate, I'm hopeful that we will get a positive decision next week in terms of executive being offered the power. That isn't the definitive moment in terms of, and the price is this, and this is all the various. There will be a period of very intensive period of continuing discussions and negotiations to hammer out some things around it, and it'll not be. I don't expect it to be offered as this is how it is offered, this is the cost and all of the accoutrements with it, and there will be work that'll have to be done. There'll also be serious work that'll have to be done very, very quickly in terms of taking the power, make sure that we do what we have to take the power, and also making sure that the legislation gets through in Westminster, because it could still fall at that hurdle. We could run out of time. I think we have, or caution, I think we have sufficient time, more than enough time. I've looked at the timetable, and there's lots of time in it, even though Parliament is prorogued at the end of March. So I think we can do all of that. But we don't have to, the price isn't going to be settled next Wednesday. There will be work, will be ongoing and all of that. And I know you're, I think, skeptical, I think, might be the way to do it, rather than an outright opponent of it. And I think that I've said to you before, I think I maybe said in the committee to you before as well, is that, that ultimately you have to do it. If you take it and you say you're going to reduce, you're going to have to do it, and it then starts to impact. But we have some time leading into all of that, both to hollow out the exact cost, but also to plan as an executive how we're going to pay for it. And you're right, there's a risk of fluctuations moving forward, but the executive knows in taking it, the executive will know that is a risk that they are taking on, just as we know that we are taking on, and there's been a lot of concentration over the last number of years of the benefits of taking it, and lots of concentration on the number of jobs it's going to take, and what the cost might be. And obviously you expect me in my position to be particularly interested in where we find money to pay for it over time. But I think, again, that's where restructuring our workforce and making significant savings moving forward not only helps us to live within our means within our budget, but also gives us some headroom to deal with issues like corporation tax.
Chair,
Sorry, John, you've had 3 questions at the moment. Everyone else has had 2 so far.
It's only half a dozen less than the chair.
If you don't mind, John, we'll move on to Ian.
Okay. In respect of the wider budgetary, draft budget and the attempts and discussions that were around trying to get that agreed, I think it has been referred to that obviously it was just a DUP Sinn Féin agreement, and those who either voted against or indeed abstained did so for whatever their own reasons were political or just opposition. In respect of your conversations that you have had with those parties or any ministers, have any alternatives been brought forward as to how this could be sorted or divided up in a better way, or is it just a case of just politicking for politics' sake?
Look, I think the minister who
The others wanted more.
always want more. The minister who voted against was always going to vote against. I don't think it would matter what the settlement for his department was or how the overall budget looked. I don't think he was ever going to vote for it. The ministers who abstained, well, I haven't met one of the ministers who abstained. So he certainly hasn't
Come forward with
offered anything formally or face-to-face yet. He couldn't, obviously, because I haven't met yet. What tends to happen, I suppose, more whenever you have bilaterals is that they tend to be more about that particular minister's department and less about the whole picture. The two ministers who abstained did, in discussions before we agreed the draft budget, suggest a number of areas where they thought refinement could be made. Now, I think it's one thing asking for and getting an alternative back. It has to be a viable alternative, and by viable, I suppose there's different sets of criteria. You know, is it politically acceptable to other parties, therefore getting the votes for it? And some of the suggestions that did come forward were absolutely fine and worthy of discussion and worthy of further investigation. And I said that to them at the time, but weren't necessarily capable of doing anything for the year we're talking about for 15-16. So you've noted that I've been talking about both here and in recent days about getting a reform and restructuring plan in place, because that's the point I made at the end of my opening comments. This is not just 1 year we're talking about. We can't just say, look, we've got to do this in 1 year and then forget about it. We've got to start using now and next year to plan for the future. So in that context, whilst I don't think that some of the suggestions that are some of the alternatives that are coming forward particularly help us out of our 15-16 problem, they could be of merit for the years beyond that. And you know, and in that spirit of trying to find a final budget that has as broad a possible support as we can get, because I think that's important. I'm happy to work with those ministers who do come forward with, and to date there are only a couple who have suggested anything else, and I don't think some of the stuff is viable. I don't think some of the stuff is credible. Some of the stuff I do think has some merit. I'm happy to work with them on that as part of a plan for not just 15-16 but actually beyond.
In respect of, I don't think there's any one that sort of works around this place or works with departments that doesn't believe that there's wastage within individual departments, and whether it's paying for consultants to do pieces of work or what it may be. Is there any work that, as Minister for the responsibility for divvying out that money, is there any work that's being done or being considered to try and see how we can actually reduce the wastage that is within the system so that we can get down to delivering services without all that wastage being part of it? I think I was looking through whenever it was reference to your quotes in the Assembly, a quote that I came across was, "The waste of money cures itself, for soon there's no more to waste." So can we get
that's not Mandela, sure, isn't it?
No, nor JFK, for that matter. But nonetheless, we do have to, and I don't think even yourself would deny the fact that there is wastage within departments, and things couldn't be done a whole lot better without that. So, are you looking at any possible ways of dealing with that?
I think that I mentioned before that I think there are some in DFP's role as an enabler of reform and change and efficiency. Actually, there are some things that I mentioned, shared services. There's also digital delivery of services where we can support other departments to make changes which are relatively painless, actually, but present them with savings and actually a better outcome and better service. So very keen to not force that on them, but I think that if you look at shared services or the digital delivery of services or asset management or collaborative procurement, these are areas which some departments may have seen as well. It sounds like a nice idea and all of that, but not for us, or we're different, or we'll do that eventually. They're kind of running out of time, and I have to say, if ministers are not prepared to seize that awful phrase, a low-hanging fruit of efficiency through shared services or digital delivery or better asset management or collaborative procurement, and if they're not prepared to do that, then I have little sympathy for some of the bigger issues that they're contending with, and trying to give them support for that. I think there are opportunities for ministers to make fairly easy savings. Now, they'll not be savings that'll fill in the hole that they have, but I'd probably more sympathy to help them on other things if they were helping themselves a bit. I think what we have with over the last number of years, departments have faced efficiency savings, annual efficiency savings, percentage efficiency savings. And I think what it has shown is, and we've managed to live within our means by and large over that time. What that has shown is that year-on-year savings of say 2 or 3% are quite achievable for departments. Once you get sort of to 5 and beyond, it does put more pressure on them. And I suppose what I am looking for, and whilst I'm more than willing to help, whether it's around those sorts of things that I was talking about, or whether it's about alternative models of service delivery, or whatever it might be, whatever we can help them with, happy to do. I'm using the Change Fund to perhaps stimulate some of that change. I'm looking to ministers to themselves be innovative within their own departments. They know their departments, or they should know their departments better than I do. They will know what is possible, and stuff that has perhaps been sitting on, again, maybe on a long list of desirable but not immediately desirable stuff nearly needs to be brought forward now, and it is not desirable anymore. It's a necessity. So I would be hoping, and again, I think that feedback certainly from discussions that officials have had with other officials, and indeed the engagement I've had already with ministers, is that there is a preparedness to look at things that might be seen as a bit more creative and imaginative than would otherwise have been the place. Now, we could argue that, well, why weren't you doing that in the first place? But, necessity is the mother of all invention, and they are certainly in a position now where they're having to be inventive because of the circumstances that they face.
Thanks, Minister. We'll move on to Paul. Thank you very much indeed, Chair. Minister, it's really to come in on the point of the resource, Dale, and we've 10.2 billion of resources that Dale allocated or proposed for 2015-16, with 550 million of that being ring-fenced for what is deemed to be probably depreciation and whatever else. Can I ask, is there any possibility of giving a breakdown as to what is deemed to be depreciation and impairments? Because I know that each department probably will have their own way of actually covering depreciation and impairments within their own budget. But 550 billion or million, half a billion being set aside out of next year for that. Can we have maybe a wee bit of detail on that?
Yeah.
And it's just to go on at another point, and workforce planning, which is something which we should have been doing and should be an ongoing process, not something that we do whenever we come against trouble. Unfortunately, we ran into difficulties with workforce planning within the PSNI whenever they went through that process and identified major problems because we got rid of a lot of people who had skills. Is there a question there, Paul? Somewhere. Well, there's already one question has been asked, and I don't know whether you picked that up, Chair, but there's one question has been asked. It's workforce planning. What workforce planning has went on in the past and what is proposed for the future? And I appreciate we made comment about JFK and Mandela. I think that might well be the Trojan horse within the statement I put out. But that's beside the point.
Where Belfast City Councillors getting too much bother.
You don't mind?
Yeah. There's a within the take the first point. I think might have been the only question, actually, to be fair.
Workforce plan isn't
Workforce plan. On workforce plan, you're right. I guess you're right, actually, that we probably should have been doing this earlier. I don't think that there's perhaps a stimulus, to do it on the scale that we're talking about. And we have been able to. I suppose there's a macro context in which to maybe fit that decision not to aggressively look at our workforce over the last number of years, because the economy wasn't doing great and there was a large bit of a spike in unemployment, thankfully not as high as others endured. If we had been also going at the public sector numbers at that time, the economy would have been in an overall worse position. So it has provided us with something of a cushion in the last number of years, and that's not a nice way to describe our public servants or our public sector. But economically, it hasn't been bad to have had a large public sector at a time whenever the private sector was stagnating. But obviously that has changed, and the private sector is doing a lot better. The economic growth of 1.2% year on year is being driven by two sectors of production and our services sector, and public sector actually already starting to head in a negative direction in terms of economic growth. So I think perhaps we should have thought about it, maybe had a little bit more work in place, because that's being truncated into a very, very quick period of, or a short period of time. But I don't know whether there would have been the need to take out head count to the degree. I mean, there have been some people, very, very few people have made redundant, but there have been some have gone in very specific cases of prison officers and planners and things like that. On the resource style, or the ring fence resource style position, there's a table contained within our draft budget consultation document, which breaks it up by department. Each of those figures is then further would be, for previous years, I suppose, would be included in each departmental set of account. I'm sure we can gather that together for the committee, or if the committee can't do that themselves. In terms of what it counts, it's not a, Mike can correct me if I'm wrong in saying this, but it's not a matter of, there are policies in places that count what is depreciation, what isn't. There's accounting standards that departments have to adhere to, and that, in fact, actually those standards, I think, are set by Treasury. They define how much we're able then to, it's they who decide what is ring fence and what is non-ring fence then.
It's not a question that if there's unused ring fence DL, it can be used anywhere else. It can't. It can only be used specifically for those purposes.
It's ring fence.
It can't be. It's not as if it can be diverted into mainstream.
It's not a ring fence decision taken by us as an executive. It's taken by Treasury.
There's just accounting adjustments.
On the workforce planning point, and with this I'll finish. On the workforce planning, it has been mentioned in the potential reduction of savings that could be made in that approach. You did allude to earlier on, whenever the chair mentioned about engagement with trade unions, and you said you had some confidence. I wonder, what do you base that on, considering some of the comments that I've heard on the media have been anything but positive in their approach, and at the very least showing a total lack of understanding of what we're actually up against?
I think that's a fair assessment, Chair. I mean, I've heard, I was going to say some union representatives, but I think we all know that it's more one union representative who has made some crazy comments in the media, which I don't think are reflective of the trade union movement as a whole. In terms of where they are. And I mean, the trade unions have a job to do, and they have interests to look after. And I can understand that they would fight for the best interest, and they should be fighting for the best interest of their members, and that's what their members are paying the money for. Sort of calling for strikes on a weekly basis almost, and trying to take us into a winter of discontent was thrown out again as a good old phrase. I don't think was particularly helpful, and doesn't, I think, reflect an understanding of the difficult position that we're in, or the fact that we have tried to do our best to protect the public sector over the last number of years, and unfortunately we're now in a position where that can't be done in the way that it was, although we have tried to be inventive within the draft budget to ensure that instead of it being several hundred million more, it's 200 million of reductions that we're facing, and that's including using those flexibilities that we were discussing at the start. Look, I think that there will be many members of staff who, whenever a voluntary exit scheme is put forward, will want to avail of that and will want to leave. And that will include many union members, and I'm sure that the union would not want to get in the way of those interests of those members who would want to avail of a voluntary exit scheme whenever it becomes available. So, I look forward to, and I hope that the unions will seek to work with us as we develop that scheme, which will benefit some of their members, obviously.
Is it possible just to get a breakdown of how much from the public purse is paid into these unions from the public purse per se?
Yeah, I can provide the committee for that.
As long as you don't want it right now.
No, I don't have it. I don't have it sort of instant recall.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Leslie.
Minister, many of us have been fighting against the cuts to frontline services in the health service. And one of the things that I've been told many times is, look, if we had had more time rather than just 4 months, we may well have done things differently. Did the current panic on the budget, or the panic button being pushed at June monitoring this year, is that the situation, bearing in mind that the Executive and the Treasury were aware of the figures in the summer of 2013?
Sorry, I'm just trying to unpack that a little bit. You're saying, are the difficulties that we're facing in year? You're not talking about next year. You're talking about
obviously it runs into next year, but particularly starts in year. Yes.
And what's your point? Your question is that when did we become aware of that as a problem?
That's right. Was it 2013 or 2014?
Well, we have been obviously some of I wasn't in post for the whole of 2013, but we have been since. Not long after certainly taking up post, I can recall discussions with the then Health Minister about the difficulties that he was facing within that year. And obviously we took decisions as an executive to help that department last year. There were significant allocations made to the Department of Health to try to assist it. And that wasn't enough in the end to ensure that it lived within its budget control totals. But obviously we were aware of issues. We were aware of issues that were going to crystallise in this year as well. And that's why from before and at the early stages of this financial year, I was pushing for a agreement to allocate more to that department. And thankfully we have, as an executive, finally agreed. I think that's maybe the point that you're perhaps alluding to or getting at, that we've agreed that an allocation of 80 million be made to that department, which is not everything that it needed. Now, I think there are some issues, and I've obviously spoken about this publicly, around how finances within trusts are managed. And one of the conditions put upon the initial £20 million allocation in the June monitoring round was that a piece of work be done in concert with my own officials to hollow out exactly why in the last financial year the department did overspend, and why were they not able to ensure that they didn't overspend their budget. And that has unveiled and has been acted upon actually within that department. I understand some changes that have been made in terms of control of expenditure within that department, which will, I hope, mean, and I'm confident will mean that they do not overspend this year, even though they have less money than they needed to deal with all of their pressures. And obviously that is necessitating to some very, very difficult decisions on behalf on part of the Minister or on part of trusts to try to live within their means. So, I don't envy Jim his task. I think sometimes I have a difficult job trying to get a budget agreed, but when you look at the difficult job that the Minister has to make, and he's got £4.5 billion worth of roughly of expenditure across us, so not all in health, but right across his department. It's a huge responsibility. And it's difficult, given it's so demand-led for any minister in that post, given the pressures that they're facing and the restrictions on their expenditure, to ensure that they live within their means. But I'm confident that various things from allocations to changes in terms of management of finances within the department, and the determination of the current minister to live within his budget means that they will not, what happened last year will not happen this year.
He actually was depending on an in-year monitoring in that situation. So were the real figures agreed between Treasury and the Executive in the summer of 2013?
I don't know what you mean by what real figures. I don't know what you mean by what real figures agreed between.
Well, I know that in response to a written question, the Treasury have confirmed that the figures were known and presumably agreed in 2013.
What figures? Sorry, I'm not.
The budget figures, the allocation.
Yeah, the 20
on the CSR already known.
Absolutely, they were. Yeah.
So was there all that activity during the year, or did it just happen really during this year? That's my point.
Well, I can give the same answer again.
No,
Marty might fall off his chair. It's even longer than the one I give to him. But I think what I outlined was that there was the allocation was the overall spending envelope for the executive for this current financial year or the previous financial year was known. Obviously, there are changes, there are adjustments, there are consequences, and so forth. But by and large, it's and the allocation was then made by the executive back in 2011 for what health was going to be for 13-14 and 14-15. But I hope I made clear anyway that because of the well-publicised pressures that department is facing and continues to face, that engagement was ongoing with that department, pretty constant actually, at ministerial level, also at official level. In the last year and a half, which allowed me then, because of that engagement, to make recommendations both last year and this year to the executive that more money be given, not all of the money that it needed or wanted, but more money be given within our restricted circumstances to the Department of Health to help it out.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Judith?
Thank you, Chair. And being sort of one of the last to ask questions, most of my comments have already sort of been touched on. Do you have sort of a further comment on how your discussions are going with the other ministers, and do you see that there is likely to be much of an adjustment in what was put forward as the draft budget to resolve some of the issues that have been brought up? And you've said that there's one minister hasn't engaged with you yet. Do you see that minister engaging with you going forward? And then
sorry.
I don't want to give you them all in one go.
Yeah, go ahead. I think you may even get before the chair. The chair's talking, so get as many in as you can.
Then, just touching on the issue around health, you've said that you are convinced that improvements will be made so that we're not faced with a similar overspend. But how much influence can you, as Finance Minister, actually have in enforcing changes on departments if they do not seem to be coming forward with them? Finally, just around the staff-generated ideas, you talked before about the system you put in place for that. Is that something that's happening across all departments? And if not, is that something that can happen? Because it would appear that people at higher levels are sort of trying to make the bids, and they're a bit out of touch with operational reality, and often they'll go for the kind of high level, right, we'll just cut this complete service, instead of actually seeing that more savings can be made within different business areas. And I think that's ingrained in public service, where you think, well, there's no incentive to make the savings, because if you don't spend all your money this year, then you'll not get it next year. And is there something more can be done to sort of force more of a business approach in business areas, so that public sector managers are actually forced to manage and take account of what they're actually delivering when the staff costs are going up each year, and are they actually delivering more for the money?
Yeah. Try to take them in order. It's not that one minister hasn't or has refused to engage. It's we're sequencing meetings over the next number of weeks. Four meetings have taken place, so I've got another 7. I don't have to meet myself, so it's one less meeting. I would probably disagree with myself more. Nobody, of course, Mr. Chairman, nobody has any sympathy for the reduction that the Department of Finance and Personnel has to take as well. Of course, it's something that's often forgotten about in discussions about other departments. So that minister I will meet with that minister. I think the point I was trying to make is that it was more, I suppose, a slightly political point in that whilst some others have engaged positively and come up with at least alternatives, whether they're credible, viable or achievable or not is matter for discussion. But I haven't had anything of that nature from the other minister and his party. So far, some engagements most of them have been useful, some a little less so. And it very much depends, the utility of it very much depends on the attitude that the minister brings to it, whether they're prepared to work with the very difficult circumstances they find themselves in and try to be innovative and try to be creative, and many of them are. And I can't say who, it would be unfair to say who is and who isn't, but there are some ministers who have really pleased me by how creative they have wanted to be and the ideas that they've been bringing forward, and we haven't had to force things on them. They've been coming forward with ideas. Do I see a change in our monetary circumstances between now and final budget? I wouldn't say that I don't think that there will be the ability to perhaps make some more allocations, but whenever you look at the draft budget is as tight as a drum. There's no overcommitment, and I don't think that we should, in the situation where departments are facing big cuts, be overcommitting our expenditure, because you're then relying on reduced requirements, and if departments are facing 5 or 8 or 10% reductions, the likelihood of reduced requirements is diminished then. But there may be, one possible source is the autumn statement and Barnett consequentials, although all indicators are that the Chancellor wants to make tax cuts, and he's got less tax revenue, so there may not be. I don't anticipate getting it. So there may be some things that don't materialise that frees up a little bit of money, but we're not talking about lots and lots of cash. You talk about health, but you were talking more about in year. What can I do in year to step in? There's nothing that I can't make. I can't run a minister's department for them. There's many departments I wouldn't mind running, or at least taking some decisions on behalf of some of the ministers. But there's nothing that I can do. I can monitor the information which we share with the committee, and we can monitor and we can see. And supply officers within DFP would have regular conversations about what's going on and see what's happening. If a minister is in a position where, more importantly, actually, their accounting officer believes that they are incurring a pattern of expenditure which is likely to lead to an overspend, then there are duties and responsibilities placed on that accounting officer. And Mike can keep me right if I say the wrong thing in this, but to seek a direction from the minister, which then has to come to me and to the executive. So there is a role for me, obviously, at that point, if a minister believes that they are going to overspend on their budget. Now that hasn't happened this year, and I hope that it doesn't happen this year. It didn't happen last year either. But I hope that it doesn't, because we are obviously I think everybody understands how difficult we are this year. We are still £25 million over committed as we sit here now, and we'll try to sort some of that out in the January monitoring round with reduced requirements, but we're not getting a lot of reduced requirements. So it's going to be very, very tough.
In terms of the Chancellor's statement, have you had any indications from Treasury about possible Barnett consequentials on the positive side?
No, we haven't, and we wouldn't expect that. I'm conscious that there's a question still to be answered in response to Mrs. Cochran. But on your point, Chair, no, there's not. We haven't got any. We might read about some in the Sunday Telegraph or something like that, but we will wait. I usually speak to the Chief Secretary of the Treasury a little in advance, confidentially a little in advance of the statement, so I'll have some indication next week whether we are or not. But I suppose my message to the committee and to everyone is shouldn't be holding our breath expecting a terrible lot, given various circumstances. On the point that I didn't address there about ideas generation, we've taken this concept forward into dealing with our own budget challenges within our department and trying to generate ideas from staff. The ideas engine, as it's grandly called, hasn't been rolled out across the full civil service yet. But again, it's one of those things, it is not the answer to all of our problems, but we've been crafting and building a reform infrastructure and architecture over the last year or so, which is, yes, being used in my department. Some of it's been used in concert with other departments already. But again, it's one of those things, it's not quite the same level as shared services or digital delivery or asset management or collaborative procurement, but it is something that is there to help. And that's why it was designed, and it was designed for that purpose, to help other departments to generate ideas, money-saving ideas, better service. I mean, you're right. We shouldn't just be looking at, we have to live within our means, and we can't spend more than we have. But we should also be looking at, as we're making changes, trying to do so in a way that actually improves outcomes for citizens as opposed to diminishing them in any way. And that's hard to do in the circumstances we are, but it certainly should be a principle and an objective that we have.
Okay, thanks Judith. And Michaela.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. Last but not least, Minister, just you touched earlier in your briefing and your discussion with the Chair on reducing the footprint of the office estate. Just going back to that, do you have a figure on how much savings will be raised from asset disposal? And I know there has been a number of buildings that has already been identified and what the savings are from them. But I suppose going forward, what has been done to estimate this and how much will be raised?
There's a asset management unit. It's actually an OFM, DFM, isn't it? Yeah. We work very closely with them. And on capital receipts, which are distinctly different from asset sales, some of the £108 million that was, when we were crafting the draft budget, £108 million of capital receipts had been built in, which you're going to use 100 of, or we hope to use 100 of, to pay off the loan facility. That isn't all asset sales. It's not all land or buildings. Some of it is the receipt of FTC interest coming back and various loans that are paid out and the interest getting repaid on that to us. So it's not all pure physical selling of property, getting the money for that. We thought that target was, and given where the market is, it's a little bit more buoyant, that there was scope to increase that. So we've increased that by a further 50 million, and we're confident that we can achieve that, if not even exceed that. So that's our, there are assets and asset sales and receipts that we can, I think, given where the market is, we can realise. There's also a separate and distinct, in terms of footprint, there, our asset management strategy, which is about condensing down the size of the civil service public sector footprint. And we're proving very successful at that. So our workplace NI standards, which is a sort of the open plan, sharing of facilities within offices, that sort of rollout is happening where and when it's possible. We have injected some capital into that this year, and we're trying to do some deals. It's proven difficult to get all those deals across the line in time, but this is things like buying out PFI contracts and buying property and moving into it because it's more suitable and it reduces the footprint and saves money. That has realised, I think it's £15 million a year we're saving through our asset management strategy, which is, mightn't sound a lot in the grand scheme of the budget, but is, every million, every 15 million greatly helps.
Yeah, thank you, Michaela. Minister, I believe that you will not be available on the, what is the 8th of January?
December.
Or sorry, the
available on the 8th of January.
Until the 19th of December, is that right?
Yeah.
As we had a discussion about this earlier on, and it does seem to be rather late on because it's virtually up against the end of the consultation period. Is there any possibility for an earlier date for that debate?
Well, I don't have my diary in front of me, but I know that I'm absolutely not available on some of those dates. I don't want to get into here. It's a matter for the committee. It's a take note debate that the committee wants to bring forward. We are still in the period of consultation. Departments are still bringing forward their own, because it's very difficult for departments dealing with the quantum of reductions that they're facing, some very large percentages. And I think that, I'm content to take part, and if I'm available to take part in a take note debate. And I think dates have been offered when I am free and I am available. But the executive is unlikely to agree a final budget for a number of weeks into the start of January. We can't go much beyond that because we're up against it in terms of a legislative timetable. But it does strike me that there is scope to let the consultation complete, have all departments feed their information to departmental committees, have yourself and this committee play its central coordinating role, and still have a very worthwhile take note debate the first week that we come back into the Assembly and after Christmas. In the fullness of all of that happening.
We would need to have an assurance that the debate will take place before the executive agrees the budget.
Well, I am not the executive. I can't say when the executive will sit on this. I think experience would tell me. I'm not long in it really, but experience so far is that it tends not to. This can take a little bit longer to agree, particularly difficult things like this. Than if you set a day for it, it's unlikely to be that day that the executive will agree it.
I know there have been some delays in the past. Already.
The plan is. And I can't remember the dates precisely, but I think it's like something like the 8th.
Yes, the 8th is the designated date.
And it's probably likely to be later than that. I mean, we're getting into sort of areas of setting diaries and times like that. No, but I don't anticipate the executive agreeing it before that date.
Before? You wouldn't agree? Or you wouldn't anticipate it?
No, I don't think. I think it's on. I think we're not getting in a situation where I'm trying to recall a diary which is not in front of me. We have a January monitoring paper as well to go early in January too, so that complicates things somewhat. And obviously, look, I think there will be a period of intense discussions that will take place as well between the various parties in the executive, which could elongate things a little. But I would emphasise that we can't let it roll and roll and roll either.
Okay. Minister, thanks very much for your time this morning, and the committee will be in contact with your officials about the date for the debate, which is mutually convenient to committee and yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And Mike, thank you also. Okay, members, thank you for your questions there. We'll move on. Well, before we move on, we should have some discussion about the date for the debate. The Minister seems to think that there will be no agreement on the budget at executive level until perhaps later on in January, which may give us a window, shortly after the end of recess to have the debate. But there's no guarantee, obviously, that there won't be agreement early on. So it would be a question of taking a chance.
The only thing is, Chair, we also, Minister referred there to the January monitoring.
That's right, yes.
I'd like to have a handle on that as well.
For the debate. I mean, the only other...
It sets out the starting.
It's not going to happen, Chair, then on the 8th or 9th of December. That's in the order paper. No.
That was just provisionally put down as a sort of a request.
The Minister can't be there.
The next available date, when the first plenary is going to be the 12th, Monday the 12th of January. Is that the first one after recess?
That's right, yeah.
I mean, do you go for that?
That monitoring round thing will be in very early in January.
Yeah, you said that early January should be okay.
So it's more likely to be agreed before the final budget.
So we're talking about then the week after that for the debate on the 19th or 20th of January.
Well, then you're running it very close to the budget might be agreed by the executive by the time you have your debate.
That's the problem, yes.
But
I mean, we can't have it every way. We can't have the encompass the monitoring within the budget debate and possibly run the risk of the executive having already agreed it. The other alternative is to go for the 12th of January for the budget debate, regardless of the monitoring situation.
I'd suggest, Chair, we go for the 12th of January.
The 12th or the 13th?
12th or the 13th, yes.
I mean, it's scheduled for a 3-hour debate. Is there any way we can extend that? I'm just thinking of that probably well, Peter probably knows, being in the business committee as well, that probably allows the minister, the minister will probably get at least an hour between opening and winding.
What's the sort of
the take note debate?
The length of
down for 3 hours.
I think notwithstanding any other suggestions, I think there's tend to be a sort of a general formula for the take note debates on it.
Standard time.
Chair was the take notes debate on previous occasion was 3 hours.
Yeah.
So,
but we could ask the business committee for longer if we.
Yeah, I could do. I mean, I suppose the only issue is, and I'm not objecting to that. What can you say, for instance, in 4 hours that you can't say in 3 hours?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of
focus.
Oh, sorry?
The number of members you get to speak that you mightn't get. You might get round even to my turn at that point, or other independents or.
I think it tends to be the general rule of thumb. I think in terms of opening and winding, I think doesn't the minister due to get 10 minutes for every hour of debate. And tends to be split between the two, is it, or what way?
Well,
what again was the formula?
It's normally 15 minutes for, obviously, to move the motions, which generally would be the chair.
20.
We normally allocate then the minister, obviously, have 15-20 minutes in terms of response.
I think it's sometimes tend to be, I might be wrong in this, but it tend to be on a formula that the minister gets a block of time and effectively if you divide that between whatever it's. The minister might have half an hour to do. I'm not objecting if it was 3.5 hours.
But can we agree on the 12th for the budget to take note debate?
Which month?
12th of January.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, agreed. And can we agree to request more than 3 hours, 4 hours for the take note debate? Agreed?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. We'll move on then to item number 6, which is the departmental spending plan. And we have Bridget Worth, Finance Director at DFP, whom we met last week, and Preeta Miller, Finance Division, DFP. If you want to refer to page 13 of table papers, there are some points there that you might like to consider. There is additional research material at page 16 of table papers, and the departmental's indicative spending proposals are at page 21 of the table papers. So you're very welcome back, Bridget and Preeta. So would one or other of you like to make an opening statement, or?
Well, I'm happy to move straight into questions given the time restraints if you wish.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Yeah, we can do that. You don't have even a brief introduction?
Well, I can certainly give you a brief introduction, yes.
Please, yeah.
I mean, you've seen our paper, and I know that both the Minister and the Permanent Secretary over recent times have given you a bit of context to the challenging nature of what it is that we face. We have constituted an internal review group within the department, and that group it will shortly conclude its work, making some recommendations for areas where we can further explore savings and reductions in spending. But in the absence of that review group concluding for my appearance here, we've tried to give you a high-level overview of what the department spends its money on and what sorts of things it would need to consider in making those reductions.
Okay. Bridget, can I ask you why the paper doesn't contain any really substantive proposals? our detailed information on land savings and the implications for frontline services, considering the fact that there was a commitment by all departments in the draft budget document?
Well, I believe that the draft budget document, there was some guidance issued subsequently by the department that suggested that we would first publish a high-level overview of what we might do and that detail could follow. I mean, as I've mentioned, that the scale of the challenge here is such that we're simply not in a position to produce detail to the time frame that we're in at the moment. As I mentioned, we have an internal review group which is working at rate pace to take the views of a large number of the staff within the department as to where large savings can come from for next year, and that group is already working to a very challenging timetable in reaching some preliminary conclusions next week. It will only be once we've seen those preliminary conclusions and once the Minister has had time to give those consideration that we will be able to bring forward further detail.
You see, last week, Bridget, we thought we were going to get the information this week, and now you're telling me that it'll be ready next week.
Well, I think to be fair, we've always said that this is a challenging paper to produce, and you know, we have flagged the fact that the detail it won't be available until the conclusion of this internal review group. And as I say, even then, the Minister will need some time. I mean, you'll appreciate he's not able to make decisions of this magnitude overnight. He will need some time to consider the findings of the group and to indicate to us which of those he feels we should be pursuing.
Yes, I appreciate all of that, but you know, from the point of view of meaningful consultation with this committee, it was very difficult to have that on the basis of a holding response.
I understand that, and I just simply don't have the information to give you at this time. So I can't give you what I don't have, with due respect.
Yes, I got that impression last week, all right, but anyway. If we go to paragraph 12 of the briefing paper, there's a reference there to a long list of savings identified by the departmental board to deliver reductions of 4%, as well as contingency plans being put in place for a reduction of 8%. Can you tell us any detail of these savings?
Yeah, and I mean, certainly when we were looking at a 4% reduction, we had put a plan together that would have reduced expenditure by around £10 million. So that would have delivered a 4% reduction, which I think is around about £6 million, and also the £3 to £4 million we would have needed to contain pay and price inflation. The sorts of things we were looking at there were really around procurement type savings, where we would look at some of our contracts and look at renegotiating those. Some of the ones that come up for renewal, for example, where we expected to get keener prices through things like the use of collaborative procurement to drive greater price savings. We had also looked at staff reductions, and there were a number of staff reductions where we'd identified posts. There were some posts that were vacant, some posts where we knew that staff were going to depart, and we felt that they wouldn't need to be replaced. We'd also looked at some opportunities for maximising revenue streams. One of the things the Minister mentioned was the opportunity, obviously, to bring other organisations into our shared services. That generates revenue for us, but it also generates savings for those organisations when they're taking their savings from us rather than from private sector organisations. So those are the sorts of things that were in our original plan. But obviously what we now need to do goes a long way beyond that.
Okay. Can you give us any indication of the likely scale and make-up of staff reductions?
Again, we're waiting the outcome of the internal review, but obviously with 45% of our budget being spent on staff costs, there will inevitably be a significant number of staff reducing. I wouldn't like to venture to mention a figure today, but I would say we probably are looking in the hundreds.
Okay. And Paragraph 9 of the briefing paper refers to 22% of departmental expenditure being fixed nature in the short term, and includes such things as accommodation and rent rates and utilities and so on. So what consideration have you given to the potential for office accommodation savings by moving to modern workplace design and having greater flexibility regarding location?
I mean, and we certainly have. That's something that's been underpinning our savings delivery plans over the last number of years. In the current year, as you're aware, we've been allocated £23 million of capital, which we're hoping to use to purchase a number of properties that will enable us to exit accommodation and hopefully to reduce lease costs. Obviously, we only get the opportunity to save on lease costs when a lease comes to a break point or to an end. So with the best will in the world, the opportunities are staggered over a long period of time. I mean, built into our initial 10 million of plans, I think there was about £1 million worth of lease savings in there that we'd anticipated delivering. We're also planning to spend a large amount of our capital allocation in 15-16 on refurbishing some of our owned properties to increase the floor density and to enable us then to exit leases in 16-17 and beyond, which, okay, won't help us with our 15-16 problem, but again, as the Minister has alluded to, we need to be looking to the longer term as well. So those plans are in place.
Okay. And just reference to paragraphs 18 and 19 and the equality impacts being considered. Why are the equality considerations not undertaken in parallel to ensure that decisions are informed by them?
Well, equality impacts have been considered in tandem with the original long list of savings. The time constraint on the internal review hasn't lent itself, I suppose, to equality considerations being built into what they've been doing. They've been primarily looking at the viability and feasibility of the ideas delivering savings in the short term. The nature of DFP's activities tends to be such that actually most of what we do doesn't tend to have a large equality impact, simply because most of what we do is providing shared services to public servants, and a reduction in those doesn't tend to have any equality impacts for us. So I think if the sorts of things that we were considering were more likely to have a higher quality impact, we would absolutely be having to look at that at an earlier stage and as a more integral part of what we're doing in the internal review. That's not to say that we're ignoring those considerations, and that we will, once we have our short list of things, we will certainly be making sure that they don't have any equality impacts that we hadn't anticipated.
And will that be before or after the Executive has agreed the final list of savings?
Sorry. It will be before it will certainly be before my Minister has agreed the savings.
Right, so it will be before then. Okay, Paul.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. It's really down to the administration costs within the department, and I appreciate we are projecting a cut next year, but over the last 2 years, we've seen a 5.6 or almost 6% increase upon the administration cost within the department. Is there any explanation as to why we have incurred an extra increase? I think we're the second largest rise. I think there was one other department had a rise within their administration cost. But
absolutely. I mean, it's primarily due to the fact that we are onboarding more organisations into our shared services. So the Department of Justice has recently taken up both Account NI and IT Assist services. So that has led to a transfer of funding into DFP's admin costs that would previously have been in the Department of Justice's costs.
That's very interesting, because this leads me directly to something that we encountered through another committee that we're sitting on. have you actually identified that there has been a reduction within their administration by a comparable amount, or are they still, because from what came through in a PAC report, a lot of them are still doing those functions, even though they had, in terms, said that they were buying into some of this in relation to procurement and had you all of those issues, they were dealing with it. Oh yes, we're part of that, but yet they continue to have all of those resources still within their own department, doing the checks and everything else.
You'll appreciate I can't really answer for the Department of Justice, but they would have had a business case that would have supported their move into those shared services, and experience has shown...
I'm not picking one department, because I think that this was not reflected on one department. It ran across numerous departments, and I can understand, yes, an increase in our budget, but I would have conversely liked to have seen the complete removal of a whole tier within theirs. If, whenever you say that you can make the saving, I'm not saying about removing 200,000 from one department and adding 200,000 into another department, because if you're going to actually work in a collaborative approach, you should be seeing, instead of 200,000 reduction, you should be seeing a greater reduction, because more people are adding into working more effectively and more efficiently. So we haven't seen that, and it's not been demonstrated. I appreciate in practice it should work, but we're not necessarily seeing it on the figures that are being presented to us right across the board.
And obviously I can only answer for my own department in that respect. So
we dealt with it through PAC, and I must say it's something which I think we need to actually pass information through and ask each department to come back and tell us where those reductions have been made within their budgets.
Paul.
Department.
Thank you. Martin, to finish.
Ms. Worth, thank you, and thank you for coming with the paper as well. And I appreciate you can't give us information that the Minister hasn't decided yet, and that when you're still going through this process of considering where cuts will come. But I wonder, could you, to the top of your expertise, to give me some information about a broader matter, which won't only apply to this department, but the Minister did mention this morning that every Minister he had met, and he presumes to be across all departments, that people would be willing to have a voluntary redundancy scheme and reduce headcount. So I presume that we're going to hear more of that in the weeks ahead. Tell me how that works, how it works perhaps within DFP and then other departments. So the Minister has to save 15 million or make cuts of 15 million this year. If he, and I presume from his comments this morning, he also will come forward with a scheme for voluntary exit. He won't incur the cost of redundancies, is that right? That will go to this central pool. But when will he get the benefits? That's my understanding. There's 100 million set aside for redundancy payments. So let's say, for example, that he let 10 people go, or 100 people, or whatever. When does the department get the benefit of that?
Well, my understanding, and you have to bear, I don't know all of the detail of what's going on in the other parts of my department who are dealing with planning the scheme, but my understanding is that the plan is for the first tranche of people to exit in early September. And so we wouldn't start to see any cost reductions in the department until midway through the year. And obviously we'll have to make plans on that basis that will recognise that there'll maybe be other short-term measures that we'll need to take just for next year, because we won't see a full year's worth of reduction in those staff costs until the 16-17 financial year.
But part of that could be, if there is a scheme within DFP and other departments, part of saving the money could be a redundancy scheme. Some of the benefits will be felt this year, but not them all.
That's my understanding.
Okay. Right, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. The internal project team, its tasked with making savings. What progress has it made to date, and what opportunities has it identified for savings and for raising of revenue?
Well, they have had a large number of workshops. I think it's up into the 30-odd workshops with staff, and I think that's covered hundreds of staff across the department. I know that that has generated hundreds and hundreds of ideas, and that those ideas have now, they've been sifted, so we've now got a long list of ideas that we think have some viability, but they're now being subjected to a round of senior management meetings where the ideas that are relevant to each business area are being scrutinised for viability by the senior management in those areas. Myself and Preeta have had quite a hectic schedule over the last couple of weeks, attending a lot of those meetings to make sure that senior management are not simply dismissing some of those ideas out of hand, and that, you know, we are bearing down on costs and sharing the pain, I suppose, across all our business areas where there are opportunities. As I say, we're not yet in a position where we've got a final list of things that we might do, but the sorts of things that are coming out of that are, as you've mentioned, the maximisation of revenue, where people are identifying areas where we could maybe market our services more strongly, particularly those that are more discretionary, so that we're increasing our revenue generation. There's been a strong theme around where people perceive there to be duplications of processes across the department, where people feel that they're having to go through an interim step before they get an outcome. So we're certainly looking, that's mainly in some of our corporate service areas, things like finance and IT and HR, where we're looking at, can those be streamlined any further? And as the Minister's mentioned, the greater use of our shared services and what opportunities there might be there. That probably gives you a flavour of the sorts of things that are coming out of that.
And is there any similar process ongoing in other departments?
I mean, again, I can't really speak for what other finance directors and other permanent secretaries are doing. So
okay. Yeah,
I found it a very, very useful process.
Right.
You know, in terms of not just in terms of generating ideas that maybe myself and finance colleagues wouldn't have thought of, but I think in terms of staff engagement, we're going through a rough time. It's going to be hard for staff.
Yes.
It's good, I feel, for them to have the opportunity to come up with some solutions to that problem, rather than feeling like they're sitting waiting for things to be done to them.
Okay, thank you for that. And regarding the financial transactions capital, what use will the department make of that scheme?
To be honest with you, we're finding it quite difficult to identify opportunities for DFP to make use of that within our own department. Most of our capital spend does go on maintaining our properties, and then secondary to that on our IT systems. And whilst we're open to opportunities, and we are working with the Strategic Investment Board, particularly on the asset management strategy, and they are looking for opportunities that might be for the use of financial transaction capital, we haven't actually identified any opportunities as yet.
Is it likely that you will?
I'm having trouble, to be honest, conceptually figuring out what we would do in terms of a capital purchase on the accommodation front that would alleviate, that wouldn't lead to some sort of rent that would actually potentially give us a resource pressure. So I'll just be honest with you, I'm struggling to see how we could make good use of it, but I'm not going to cease trying.
Okay, thanks. Leslie, you want a question on that?
Yes, indeed. I've been concerned for a long time that this, important asset's going to be wasted, and part of the problem, why it hasn't happened, and we're going to be sending back maybe 30+ million this year, is because very few departments have really got a hold of this. Mm-hmm. You've got to do it with the private sector. There is no format, there's no body, in fact, set in place to negotiate that. Mm-hmm. So sitting back and scratching your head in your own office and thinking, what can we do? That's not how you tackle the problem.
Well, as I say, we are working with the Strategic Investment Board. I know they're engaging with the private sector, but as I say, I'm struggling to understand why a private sector organisation would take on board civil service office accommodation without wanting to charge us for its use.
Well, as you know, that was the policy up until quite recently, that we were going to sell off the estate as far as possible, get the improvements carried out, and then lease back.
Mm-hmm. And I think when we were in a time of scarcity of capital, that was the only way we could see to make the improvements to the properties that we needed to do. I think that the budget situation has perhaps flipped slightly now in that it's the resource we're short of. So we're actually trying to use our capital to leverage some of the resource savings that we are seeing.
But as you know, next year, capital budget, 12% approximately, is going to be FTC. You know, we've got to get organised. We've got to do it. Otherwise, the whole thing's a waste of space. Now, if it hadn't been for the college moving in, we really would have been in this, current sort of year. Could I just ask the Chair another wee point that arose, really? It's connected in with that. It's interesting to see that the department revalues its property every year.
Yes.
And then takes a hit on the depreciation, a notional depreciation.
Yeah.
It then has property maintenance, 4% of your budget. Is this some sort of flagellation, or what's the logic in this? It seems to me that somebody thought out a bit of the question, but not all of it. For example, property maintenance, why can't that be capitalised and taken back and you see a 4% straight away?
Okay, I'll try and address those. Government accounting rules require us to revalue our property annually, and that's why we undertake that exercise. Largely because I understand that national accounts, the way that government measures how it's doing, require us to carry our assets at current cost. And again, it's the Treasury's budgeting guidance then that causes us to need to record the accounting depreciation of those assets over their useful life. That's the depreciation element of it. You had a second part of that question.
Why then, if you want to follow that route,
yes.
I don't necessarily agree with it, but I can understand it. The other side of the coin is you're taking the full hit on maintenance. Why not capitalise that?
We can capitalise an element of our maintenance, and you'll see in our capital expenditure plan that there's, I think, something like 2.9 million that will be capital maintenance. We're only allowed to capitalise maintenance when it is a major maintenance activity. So a lot of our budget would go on routine sort of statutory type maintenance, things like lift checks and things like this, and I don't know, I always use the replacement light bulb or the door handle
that's
examples.
Okay, I understand it. But how much of that 4% then are you going to, is that the net figure?
That 4% is the figure that comes from resource as opposed to capital, yes.
So all your capital bits have been taken out, have they then?
Yes, believe me, we've looked long and hard, and we are capitalising.
Would it be possible to have some sort of information, Chair, on this, of how you appreciate and how you write back the capital element? From what we would call, generally speaking, maintenance and
we can certainly give you a definition of what we are. We have a definition of what we can classify as capital maintenance.
I'm thinking the figures, I'd like to see the clarity on the figures.
Yes, we can do that as well.
How much you've appreciated, how much depreciation therefore has increased, and you do touch on it there, and also how much is secretly sort of offset by capitalising maintenance that you're paying out of, we would have been paying out of resource there.
Yes, that should be possible. I would just like to stress that it's not done secretly, it is done transparently and in line with accounting standards.
We asked that question.
Sure, we all appreciate that.
Thank you, Leslie. Just before we finish, can I ask you, can we get a copy of the final paper whenever it is signed off by the Minister?
Yes.
I know you probably can't give me a date for that, but anyway. And there were 2 research papers which we previously sent to you. Could we have the responses to those or to the issues raised in those?
Yes, sorry, I had thought that we were going to touch on those today in oral questioning, but I can certainly follow that up with a written briefing.
Okay. Members agreed with that, yes?
Agreed, yeah.
Okay, Bridget and Preeta, thank you very much for your information today. Thank you. Since we've already discussed correspondence in the forward work plan, I now have to move on to any other business. And if there is no other business, then I declare the meeting at a close, and the next meeting will be Wednesday the 3rd of December in this room at 10 a.m. So I put the question that the committee does now adjourn.
Great.
Thank you.
Room 30.